Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of History of Today, the ongoing series I have with my wonderful guest here, Semiagog. We've talked about everything from the history of sort of imperial diversity to the history of the trans movement to all sorts of things, the legacy of the British Empire. So, this will be the fourth episode. It's interesting that this topic is coming out now. I mean, this stream has actually been planned a very long time in advance, but it just so happens that everything is really kicking off in the Middle East. So perhaps calling it a history of today is even more appropriate than usual. Mentioning my guest, Semiagog, hello, how are you?
Very well, sir, and very happy to be speaking with you again, especially on this subject, which is, as you say, quite timely, if rather depressing, taken as a whole.
Yes, I hope it won't be too depressing a stream. I mean, I'm probably going to be as detached as I usually am when discussing this sort of thing. As to the sort of thing that we aim to discuss, at the end of last year, it was actually in response to the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was to do a history of the Christians rather than simply focusing everything on Israel. And I meant to finish that discussion by bringing up this topic, but I thought, really, given the implications of Christianity fading today, I thought it'd be more appropriate to have a more general discussion within this history of today format. I would recommend people who know nothing about the history of Christianity in the Middle East, and by Middle East for this stream, I'm focusing on the Levant and Iraq. I don't really have the time or really the sort of thematic through line to discuss Egypt and Iran and other places like that. But I ended that series of videos by talking about the decline of the Ottoman Empire and ending it with the Sipho, the putting to sword of the Assyrian Christians, and the Kafno, which was the deprivation and starvation of the Maronites in Lebanon. And I want to bring that up as an if you watch this, I really want people to have a understanding of the context, and hopefully in those videos you'll find that context. Indeed, I'm going to be bringing up a lot of disparate and seemingly far-fetched comparisons, but one of the things I'm known for is bringing in spurious analogies into everything and being a pattern noticer, for lack of a better description. So I'd recommend
Noticing.
Yes, you are noticing the pattern recognition and the noticing of the pattern recognition. Anyway, so that's one thing. So we come out of the Islamic domination of the Middle East. The Ottomans have, declined. Their empire is dissolved, and really, in terms of getting us to today and how this is all relevant as informing a thematic through line from 1918 up until today, is really the entire dynamic and relationships and power structures within the Middle East have fundamentally changed from what had happened in the preceding 1,500 years when we talk about Islam and its right to dominate. Really, here we're talking about the domination of Western powers, France, Britain, and ultimately the United States, and the emergence of Israel. So I found it difficult to configure a conversation given the magnitude of the differentiation compared to that series on Christians in the Middle East. And that is really where we're going to take our cue, the end of Islam, and really what this sort of means in terms of recontextualizing the Christian relationship with not just Muslims in these new states, but with the Western powers as well. So this begins with something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I'm sure many of you are aware of what the Sykes-Picot Agreement was, which divvied up what is now Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq into mandates, zones of influence. France got Lebanon and Syria, and Britain got the rest. And I bring all this up because we're talking about the formal end of the structure of the dhimmi, the attempt to implement some form of democracy or at least secular government. And then finally, we get to places like Lebanon. We have the limits of consociationalism, which is a word I failed to pronounce in my apartheid stream, which is this idea of a multi-confessional democracy like that which is possibly going to be experimented in, or rather not, in South Africa. But also, of course, we can't really talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement without bringing up the whole idea of Arab nationalism and Muslim nationalism, how this sort of figures into a conversation about Christianity. Because how I ended the conversation on the tragedy or the agony of Middle Eastern Christendom was the failure of Christians, especially the Assyrians, to assert their own status as nations, as sovereign entities. And what I found quite interesting in terms of starting this off is really looking at how Christianity in the Middle East is so diffuse, it is so diverse, and how this really factors in to how we can understand the relationship between Western Christians. It's the heterogeneous nature of Christians in the Middle East vis-a-vis the West that really, I think, undergirds so much in terms of the confusing, and you can almost say, uh, I wouldn't necessarily befuddling, but confounding interpretations of this, because Christianity is not, sadly, Christianity is not one homogenous group of people with sharing the same outlook. Christianity in the Middle East has been through a period of schism. The schisms that are really relevant here go all the way back to the Nestorian Church. So the three sort of major groups that we talk about in the Middle East are the Nestorians, mainly focused on the Assyrians, the Miaphysites, the Coptic Christians, and the post Chalcedonians, who really include everything from Catholic to Protestants to Calvinists and to Orthodox as well, to make it even more confusing. So within those distinctions, there are further sort of elements of diffusion and religious schism and diversity. That is something I really try to bring up in those videos as to explain what exactly is going on here. But this issue permeates further into this century. And as I brought up the topic of Arab nationalism, I want to really assert that right from the outset, we have Christians who are closer in their political orientation to other Muslims and other Arabs than they are in terms of really sort of embracing this idea of Western domination of the Middle East with France and Britain after the First World War. Indeed, Christians have been associated with something in Arab nationalism known as the Nada, which means the awakening. They will later become involved in the Ba'athist movement, which means the Renaissance. And indeed, Christians will figure very poorly in the Arab Spring or the Arabi. All of these ideas, these euphemisms seem to crop up when we talk about Arab ascendancy or Arab awakening. It never really amounts to that. So part of this sort of process I'm talking about is really Christians finding themselves no longer under the domination of the Ottomans and trying to assert a new identity. Indeed, I find a lot of sort of interesting comparisons when looking at this with what happened in Vietnam, and seeing that Catholicism, say, for example, in Vietnam was very much considered to be a Vietnamese phenomenon rather than it was simply a French phenomenon, rather than the state of France persecuted Catholics, and really was the Catholics who asserted their own sort of independence and the independence of Vietnam. So you have all of these Christian groups who are pushing back against the West, who have also endured, suffered, tolerated under various Muslim rulers. All of these sort of things. Someone in the chat is asking me to define a UN mandate, or in this case, it would have been a League of Nations mandate. A mandate was basically a justification for the occupation of a region, which was eventually going to be given autonomous government or self-rule. So Iraq and Syria were originally conceived of as kingdoms. Syria got rid of its king very quickly, and then he departed to become king of Iraq. And these regions were ultimately supposed to become the independent states of Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. And ultimately, this was achieved in 1948 with varying results. So, yeah, by way of an introduction, I also wanted to bring up something which, I mean, you may get the impression with the end of the last stream, how relationships between, Christians and Muslims had fundamentally broken down. But I also want to sort of emphasize here that this process that we're talking about, the rise of sort of Arab nationalism and the creation of the mandates, is actually further distinguishing Christian groups from Muslim groups, because having these groups intermingle for so long after so many centuries and even millennia meant that there was a greater level of, you can almost say, religious syncretism. And I'm reading a paraphrase segment from James Graham's Twilight of the Saints, Everyday Religion in the Ottoman Syria and Palestine. Perhaps the most important and influential domain where different communities mixed, mingled, and shared was that of the religious practice, outside formal prayers, services, and churches, mosques, and synagogues, but often with the involvement of religious leaders such as priests, imams, and rabbis. There existed a domain of religious practices that were shared by all in the region, regardless of religion and religious community. The veneration of saints, the practice of magic, and an elaborate repertoire of bodily movements were practiced by Christians, Jews, Druze, Sufis, Sunni, and Shia Muslims, often with rather little differentiation as to a narrative interpretation. In the late 19th and early 20th century, religious reformers of all religions increasingly began to interpret these practices as old-fashioned, uninformed, rural, and superstitious. Such interpretations led to an increase in the standardization of religion with regard to theological teaching, ritual practices, as with religious institutions such as schools and church buildings, and a decline of such practices that were very visibly erased between borders of religions. Notably, many of the practices survived until the present day, either unacknowledged or scorned by the religious establishment, or integrated into more acceptable religious practices. Obviously, in the modernist interpretation of common ground, which had been the starting point of the contributions, the older form of shared cultural practices is no longer considered relevant, even if it continues to exist, and many constitute an alternative ground for community between religious groups. In many cases, however, these sacred spaces becoming locations of contestation over religious modernization in service of ethnic and national belonging. So the idea of religious and ethnic belonging, this idea of removing the intermingling sort of, you can almost say cesspool or cesspit of all of these groups coming together and forming these sort of shared sort of religion and shared language of syncretism. I emphasize this all again to say that there is a fundamentally sort of alien nature to a lot of Arab Christianity, as was perceived at the beginning of the 20th century, as to try and create this sense of separation or otherness from Western Christians, Protestants, and Catholics most specifically, and especially when we say, for example, apply this to the more sort of Eastern churches, such as the Nestorians. All of this I find rather interesting in terms of understanding, you can say, the framework from how the West essentially views the Christians in the East. Indeed, this goes all the way back from sort of the post sort of Crusader period, when you have the legacy of Catholics marrying Arabs, etc., and they weren't considered European anymore; they were considered Levantine, as in coming from the Levant. And how when the French came in the 19th century, they were very much sort of bringing with them a new Francophone Catholic culture that, in many ways, tried to harmonize, or you can even say assimilate, some of these Christian groups. Semigog was talking to me earlier about the confusing sort of nature of what the Maronites really represent. So yeah, that's my sort of very long-winded introduction in terms of perceiving the status of Christians in the Levant and the Middle East in sort of 1920. So Semigog, how do you look at that?
Well, I can only see it in terms of a broader picture because I'm not as knowledgeable about the various forms of Christianity in the Middle East as you are. So I have to attempt to grasp things with broad strokes. And as you know, my habit of mind, when it's not purely speculative and half mad, is, tends towards the geopolitical. And so I think about the background of this, where nationalism, certainly through the 19th century, had been used as a kind of scalpel to, a scalpel and a suture to both cut apart existing entities and to stitch together new ones in the service of the various imperial powers that were, very often behind these things. So, as you are well aware, as our listeners are doubtless well aware, you have the Russians coming into the Ottoman Empire and claiming to be protectors of the Orthodox, the French coming in as protectors of the Catholics. The British are left with this situation where they need to find client populations in order to jam a lever into these, territories and states. And Protestantism was not as long established in these areas. And so it seems that some decision was made at some point to make the Jews the client population, or at least one of the client populations. I'm not suggesting that the British didn't assert other interests. So this background of nationalism and its use to dismember the Ottoman Empire is I think one just sort of broad context that all the listeners should keep in mind for this. You're certainly well aware of it. Another one is that the Jews underwent a kind of reformation, as I see it, of their own, which, you know, in Jewish literature is sometimes called the kind of 19th century Enlightenment with Zionism. But for me, it is, you know, coming back to your mention of analogies. For me, it's a kind of reformation that immediately introduced its own kind of secularism as well, with Zionism as a movement. So you've got a situation where the Brits are dealing with Protestants who are divided from the majority of the Christian world, or were historically, until they asserted themselves, you know, in the course of all that business in the 16th century and the rest. And the Brits are in this position of relative weakness in terms of client populations in the Middle East, and it's due to a division that occurred within the Christian religious world centuries earlier, and the Jews become a client population for the British, and we see a kind of throwing in together with certain Protestant groups and Jews that I think is going to be a theme, certainly in terms of the later developments with post-Protestant secularism and liberalism. We're going to see that as a theme stretching across this history. Then the only other thing I'd throw in is a sort of stage setting exercise is something that people can go back and watch our previous discussions about imperial minorities. You and I spoke, I believe that was over on my channel, just about this background of different millets or confessions and ethnic groups and populations all living cheek by jowl, very often in the cities, as well in the rural areas, and how that entire history of how these people lived in the region did not lend itself to nationalism. I mean, this is all glaringly obvious if anyone looks at a map of the ethnicities and religious groupings in Lebanon. But anyone who's coming to this who doesn't know much about it should bear in mind how jammed together and heterogeneous these populations have been for quite some time, and therefore how difficult it is to simply step in and draw borders in order to create nations with some sort of homogeneity along the European nationalist lines.
Well, the question is, why even draw borders, you know, internally within this region that we're discussing? That was the argument put forward by secular Arab nationalists, and the process that I mentioned called the Nada. And you mentioned these groups commingling for a very long time, and I was trying to get that across in that segment regarding the syncretist nature of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian rituals, to the point that it actually became abhorrent to many Europeans. Is this idea that these groups have been living side by side for, you know, in terms of Jews and Christians for 1,000 years, in terms of Muslims for 1,500 years. You know, these are the oldest regions in the earth when it comes to the association of these various groups. And unfortunately, today it is the area where it has become essentially most hostile. But you mentioned, interestingly enough, the status in the Jews, and why, in particular, the Jews were the ones to become the client group in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, because it is really the Balfour Declaration, in my view, which causes for the mandate system to be created in the way that ultimately it transpired, with Iraq being joined together with Jordan and Palestine, which would ultimately evolve into Israel and Palestine. And this is fascinating because we talk about the idea of the Levant and Lebanon and Syria, when historically these were all treated as one region. Indeed, one of the sort of novelties, or you can say historical tragedies, which the Europeans visited upon this region, is taking, you can say, almost arbitrary provinces of the Ottomans, vilayets, and smashing them together in a way that had never sort of been conceived of before. And this is actually marked when we talk about Palestine and we talk about Lebanon and we talk about Syria, because even mentioning those as separate nations around the time of 1920 is really rather preposterous. Before, they had been part of the Vilayet of Beirut. And that was really to emphasize the centrality of what is now Lebanon within the context of the economy of the Ottomans, but also foreign influence. We're talking specifically French influence. Beirut was a nexus for economic investment. The port was constructed by the French. And we see the Catholic schools, Catholic missionaries, invariably they would all speak French. And of course, why did the Maronite Christians suffer so much during World War One? It was a combination of the European blockade and the fact that the Ottomans were more than willing to simply allow these groups to starve from lack of naval supplies, rather than allow them to go over. And as you mentioned, Semigog, be part of these, you can say, internal groups or fifth columnists that would support the Europeans, which is why the Armenians were treated in the horrific way that they were. So what I'm really trying to emphasize actually here is that in the Beirut Vilayet, you actually have a organization within the Ottoman Empire, a province of the Ottoman Empire, where the Christians have, you can say, a protected position. And one of the first things that the British and French do when they come in with the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration is they basically upend all of that, to the point that, ironically, it actually spurs on the creation, you can say, of these anti-Western Arab sentiments among the Christian population. Indeed, there is a push from among other sectors, even the Vatican, to pursue a Arab-speaking Christianity rather than a Francophone-speaking Christianity in the mandates of Palestine. And really, you can say this is why we even have the nations of Syria and Lebanon, is due to this this mandate, essentially, to allow for the purported, again eventual realization of a Jewish home state, where before then you have all of these intermingling ideas. So something that I really want to posit here is actually, you can say that part of the origins of a Palestinian identity are actually the result of former French Catholic schools of instruction, really trying to assert an identity which is something other than being Jewish, where previously all these groups essentially been meshed together. And this really comes to the whole sort of eventual construction of what Lebanon is and what Lebanon is meant to represent. But there is something I really want to emphasize here in terms of a continuation from the last stream, which was focused on the Assyrian genocide, which was the death of the Assyrian nation, because this also brings into question all the conflicting ideas between these new nations being set up, and secularization versus a religious state, effectively. And you also brought up the system of the millets. And this sort of pertains to the idea of Assyria, because Assyria was essentially a group of Nestorian Christians. Another organization within that whole structure is what a Chaldean effectively represents, which is a Catholic Christian. And again, we're talking about Syriac liturgies and all that sort of thing to make it more than sort of complicating. But one of the first things that we see in this mandate period and the period moving into the 1930s is the death of any prospect of a Christian Assyrian nation in the Middle East, which would, at this time in 1932, be the first, you can say, homogenous Christian nation in the Middle East. Refugees are moving out of the Ottoman Empire following the Sifo, following the Assyrian genocide, out of Hakkari province into a region known as Bakuba, which is just outside of Baghdad. And really, you can say the folly of the Assyrians is that they have an interesting political system which goes, all the way back since the time of Tamerlane, which is a hereditary patriarchate, which is vested in the Nestorian Church, which is now the Assyrian Church. And one of these hereditary patriarchs had been the leader of the Assyrian struggle during the First World War. His successor, one Mar-Eshai Shimun, wanted to realize this idea in the 1920s of a patriarchal state, which would ideally return to Hakkari province, but after the treaties of Lucerne that recognized the borders of modern-day Turkey. That would prove to be completely unfeasible. So instead, the Assyrians focus on the creation of a homeland in the Nineveh Plains, which are the region just north of modern-day Mosul, basically surrounded by Kurds. And really, the history of the Kurds and the Christians is incredibly fraught, going back for centuries, and series of low-intensity conflict. But regardless, one of the implications here of trying to set up a patriarchate, a Christian patriarchate north of Mosul, is to consciously reject the idea of the legitimacy of Iraq as being a separate state. And this is why the British were not prepared to support this. Indeed, many Arab Christians, non-Assyrian Christians who lived in Iraq, were not happy to go along with this pet project effectively, because it was a form of, you can say, Assyrians upsetting the delicate balance between Muslims and Christians, and indeed this idea of Christians and Muslims setting up an avowedly secular state, something that Saddam Hussein would try and ultimately perhaps fail to achieve. All of these things going on. And the failure of these negotiations lead to one Iraqi general, Bagir Siddiqui, campaigning north of Mosul to Simele, leading to the Simele massacres, which resulted in the deaths of about 3,000 to 6,000 Assyrians. And really, this also results in the, you can say, I would almost say the definitive loss of the prospect of Assyrian nationhood, where we see the division of Syriacs, Chaldeans, and Assyrian Nestorians all sort of going their different ways and forming their own sort of expatriate communities in the West and notably America. Now, this is looking at an idea essentially, which is how can we maintain a ancient political unit, which will basically almost be a hangover from the Ottomans, which is a ethnarch, a religious ethnarch, almost trying to reconstruct a millet within Iraq, which in this case would be the creation of an Assyrian millet within Iraq, or an Assyrian nation. That idea completely fails, and by the 1930s, you can say this ancient sort of holdover from the old Ottoman structures of administration have simply collapsed. And this also comes into question the idea of Muslims and Christians embracing democracy. And something else I want to bring in here, which is a video I did quite a long time ago on the creation of Pakistan. And the idea with the creation of Pakistan is that as India was moving more and more towards the idea of democracy, as the monarchical structures of the British Raj were fading and the British were now intent to leave India, the idea dawned on many Muslims that their political rights would be held to the whim of the Indian majority, the Indian Hindu majority. And Nehru, the leader of the Indian National Congress, was focused on creating a unitary democratic state. And when looking at someone like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he was very much focused on the religious revival led by Mahatma Gandhi, and believing that any pretense of a unitary secular state would undoubtedly devolve into a Hindu sectarian state. And weirdly enough, we're actually seeing something like that in modern day India with Modi. So you can say among the Assyrian Christians and some Christians in Iraq, there was an idea essentially of creating a separate Christian state or identity. Indeed, you can say the Assyrian identity is fundamentally ancient when compared to something as novel as Pakistani identity, which was really conceived of as an actionable program as late as the 1930s, then came into existence in 1947. But really, if we're going to look at some form of Christian Pakistan in Iraq, that project fundamentally failed, and the Iraqi Christians, therefore, would essentially be beholden to all of the forces which would come about and attempt to ruin them. And as we're seeing now, Iraqi Christianity is basically all but non-existent. We'll get into that a bit later. But then we come to the example of Lebanon, because the flip side of this idea of the failed attempt, the last real attempt of forming some sort of Assyrian nationhood out in Iraq, is the creation of Lebanon and trying to reconcile Christian presence in the Middle East with the ideas of democracy falling on from the collapse of the Millet system and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Because in 1932, in Lebanon, which was a subset of the French Mandate, again, the French have a very strong connection to the Christian Maronite and Catholic population, which goes all the way back to really, you can say it actually goes all the way back to Louis Philippe, but even before then, it goes back to this idea of Napoleon III and his mission, his mission to spare the Maronites from Kurdish and Druze reprisals in the 1860s. In 1932, there was a census that established that there were 6 Christians for every 5 non-Christians, which would include Sunnis, Shias, and Druze. And around this, in 1943, as the French mandate was finally returned to the control of Free France during World War II, the Lebanese conceived of a new sense of nationhood and a constitution based on this idea of consociationalism, which I brought up at the beginning, which is that the Catholics, the Maronites, who were the most prominent, would hold on to the position of president, which was an executive presidency. The Sunni Muslims would control the office of prime minister, and the Shiites would control the office of speaker. So long as that balance was maintained, the idea is that there could be some vestige of a democratic superstructure within Lebanon, which will come out as a nation in 1943, and that can survive for the foreseeable future. And of course, that fundamentally fails. And then we go down to this question, back to this question fundamentally of a Western betrayal. As we see, France had a far more deferential approach towards Christians in the Middle East, but Britain was perceived as actively betraying the Christians in the Middle East. I already brought in the fact that the British mandate in Palestine ruined the Ottoman province of the mainly sort of, say, Francophone Catholic influence, Vilayet of Beirut. And then, of course, when we come to the idea of Syria, it's not only the fact that the Assyrians were denied nationhood, similar to the Maronites in Lebanon during the mandate period, which meant that when the Iraqis took full control in 1932, 1933, they were allowed to go around and repress and massacre the Assyrian population. This is idea that the British allowed it to happen. And indeed, if you go all the way back to the 19th century, 100 years earlier in the 1830s, British missionaries are going over to the Assyrian populations, the Nestorians, and asking, will you join us as partisans against the French partisans of then Muhammad Ali Pasha? They join only to end up being massacred by the Kurds. And unfortunately, the same thing occurs essentially almost eerily similar 100 years later. But I've mentioned quite a lot, Semigog. Do you have anything you'd like to bring up?
Well, yeah, perhaps you can tell me whether or not this is the time for it, or perhaps this is something that we should consider after more ground has been covered as a sort of summary thing. But one thing that certainly comes to mind for me is the question of why it is the British seem to care so little, and that might be putting it charitably, about these long established forms, ancient forms of Christianity in the Middle East. You know, you brought that up, you know, in terms of how they were seen as, in fact, betraying Christians there. And I think that that's a very important question, and one that perhaps we can deal with in summary or look at a bit here. What do you think?
No, we can do that now, because I think it pertains a lot to how the Christians were also affected in the Iraq War. We can bring that up now.
Well, to me, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this, because I'm still forming my view of it. But I think a great deal of it hinges on this idea of Protestantism as radically standing apart from these other older forms of Christianity. I mean, this certainly the case can be made that, you know, the Church of England perhaps represents a less radical departure, but certainly, you know, the Anabaptists and others, you know, a lot of these people who headed to the United States in the 17th and 18th centuries, you know, these are much more radical departures from traditional Christianity. And to some extent, one is forced to wonder if throughout the history of Protestantism, whether Protestants of one stripe or another really cared much one way or the other, or at all, about these other forms of Christianity. I mean, you know, after the 30 Years' War, it's certainly clear that there could have been quite a bit of bad blood between them, and certainly was in many cases. And another interesting thing, a friend of mine was doing some research on early Protestantism, which isn't much discussed, in Spain in the 17th century. And in reviewing a lot of their old documents, he mentioned to me that he kept coming across references on the part of the Catholic authorities, Inquisition records in large part, references to the Protestants as a kind of crypto Jew. Having focused so heavily on the Old Testament and the idea that the Bible is the sole source of or sole basis upon which a true Christianity should be founded, they were considered crypto Jews. And so I guess this is what I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on. One is this sort of early association between Protestants and Jews, which will lead us to other subjects, everything from dispensationalism to millennialism, millenarianism, or whatever, premillennial Zionism. These Christian ideas of Zionism and the need for this state of Israel. So that's one angle. There's the angle of whether or not Protestants could be said at various points in their history to give a damn about these other churches at all. And now the third one has escaped me, but it will come back. That's perhaps enough to get started. The early Protestant predisposition to seeing a potential alliance with Jews, and the concern or lack of it on the part of Protestants for other forms of Christianity.
I have an article really sort of set up for this for this idea that you're sort of bringing about when it comes to the Protestant Christians. I just want to, if it's possible, I just want to hold off on that particular association just for a few minutes because I have a short article I want to read before then. The reason I want to hold off is just keeping this conversation Iraq specific. You're very correct, I think, in noticing that I actually brought it up from I'm not sure whether he's being deliberately provocative in the chat, but this comment here, which could perhaps fundamentally summarize the Anglican position when it came to the Nestorians, and that is fundamentally true. One is to say, what is more important for the British in Iraq in the 1920s and 1930s? Is it Christian ecumenism, or is it the support of a secular puppet state that will allow the British to have a steady supply of oil? And I think, Semiorg, you can understand which is the more sort of pragmatic response for that for the British. And as a result, not only to the Assyrian Christians, but the Arab Christians of all sort of denominational persuasions fall by the wayside. That distinction doesn't really exist in France, funnily enough. And the novelty, of course, is that the Catholic connection in the Levant between France is actually much stronger than it is, say, for example, in somewhere like Vietnam. And that in itself is something I covered on another video here. But just to emphasize that, the fact that the Maronites were effectively in communion with the Pope, they aren't, full Catholics in the sense that, I would understand them liturgically, but they are in communion with the Pope. That in itself would mean that they are far more, say, for example, connected to the Catholic Party within France, to the Catholic missionaries, to the Catholic schools, which really makes us understand this privileged position of the Maronites within the structure of the Levant from really the 1860s up until 1943. With the major exception as for when the Ottomans essentially wanted to starve the population from 1915 up until 1918. But you're right, essentially, that the consequence of all of these denominational schisms and differences in religion means that, and a lot of people have been bringing it up the chat, and I'm not sure whether this is deliberately provocative, but this idea that how can one really sort of embrace a full all-encompassing ecumenism? And by ecumenism I mean not all religions, I mean specifically Christian churches, together, and use that basically as a leitmotif for foreign policy, as opposed to focusing on more pragmatic considerations. And as for the British in the 1920s and 1930s, I really fail to see Christianity as being a major foreign policy consideration for the British in the last 100 years. I don't really see it anywhere. So yes, it would be entirely
with perhaps the exception of the evangelical picture, though of course that applies much more. Evangelical Christian Zionism, though of course that applies much more to the United States. In that respect, they seem to be interested.
When I'm referring to this, I'm not referring to Christians influencing foreign policy. I mean Christians being a consideration for foreign policy when it comes to foreign countries, not necessarily Christians making those specific sort of entreaties.
And one very short thing, and forgive me, but I should point out, just for those who don't know, certainly Christians in the Middle East know about this, but even indifference can easily be seen as a kind of betrayal because of its results on the ground. If these other Western powers don't take an interest in Christians, even standing back far enough to say, well, we're just not going to get involved in that, that's an internal matter. There is a long-standing practice in the Middle East, and specifically in Muslim countries, of doing what I refer to as just sort of lying on you with a heavy weight, waiting for you to exhale, knowing that once you finally do exhale, you can't fill your lungs again. And in that respect, slowly smothering these populations. You know, there's the Turkish practice of not really permitting major renovations or repairs to historical Christian churches. You know, in Istanbul, there was a lot of that going on. You would see these old churches and they're just in bad disrepair. There is the practice of simply not getting law enforcement to look into things. I did a quick look through Turkish sources, and you know, it's easy to find like 2019 6 Syriac Christian villages being burned in what is suspected arson, and law enforcement not really doing anything about it. There are the Zirve Publishing House murders, which took place in 2007 in Malatya in Turkey, where 3 employees of a Bible publishing house were tortured and had their throats cut. There are less noxious but still significant things like storehouses of Bibles that had been sent over to the Middle East as part of missionary work being burned, and then law enforcement not looking into it. So whenever we talk about whether or not countries like Britain took much of an interest in Christians in the region, everybody has to bear in mind what this background is, this idea of just sort of lying on someone till they exhale so they can't take a breath again. There's a steady, passive, and sometimes not so passive pressure on these groups in order to slowly smother them out.
And one can refer to that as collateral damage, or one can refer to that as actually what the Pope has brought up recently, the idea of murderous indifference. And this is a sort of interesting sort of way to bring the conversation about sort of you can say Muslim sovereignty, Muslim nationalism, the conversation regarding the mandates to a close, because this is a short segment from an article which is actually part of a book called Modernity, Minority in the Public Sphere, Jews and Christians in the Middle East. There is a spurious connection, I think, regarding the position of the Greek Christians within the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, where the Phanariotes were essentially a tolerated elite for their diplomacy and their business connections with the Ottomans, to the extent that when the Greeks precipitated their War of Independence in 1821, it was seen by the Ottomans as a wholesale betrayal of a group that was essentially privileged within the hierarchies of the Ottoman Empire. So the consideration is here is how to view the Christians in the round throughout this region of Levant and the Middle East, to focus on the fact that they didn't really assimilate these ideas of, with the exception of Lebanon, these you could say arbitrary distinctions in nations very well, that there was fundamentally transnational dynamic to this community. And just quickly use the summary here. But yes, Sebigog, do interrupt me. Meanwhile, Another nation state in the making was to create its own minorities inside and outside the country. The creation state of Israel, and really the Israeli situation is what fundamentally changes everything. So this is why I'm sort of demarcating this from pre-1948 until post-1948, when we have the Nakba, the cleansing, and all of the considerations and demographic changes that brings to the Middle East in terms of trying to understand the Middle East before that period. The creation of the State of Israel, with the official backing of the United Nations, changed the rules of who belonged to the majority population overnight. This was the case in the confines of the newborn State of Israel, where many Palestinians were forced to flee during the War of 1948, and those that remained became minorities in the state that was predicated on Zionism, Judaism, and Hebrew. In reaction to this, Jewish communities in many places in the Middle East were cast as unwanted minorities, whether or not they identified with this new state and its non-Arabic identity, and whether or not they themselves preferred to see themselves as such. These events underline how issues of majority and minority are related not merely to the nation state as such, but to the nation state in its regional and transnational connections. That is, processes of minoritization and the success or failure of common grounds cannot be understood without also taking into account the process of migration and the emergence of transnational communities. World War I led to the emergence of a number of refugee communities in Syriac, Assyrian, and Armenian Christians, most notably from Turkey. These population movements changed the social dynamics of many places in the Arab Middle East. These Christians became minorities in urban areas such as Jerusalem, Beirut, Aleppo, Baghdad, Cairo, and Mosul, whereas the rural Jazira region in northwest Syria was transformed by the influx of Christian farmers from eastern Anatolia and later by Haqqari Assyrians expelled from Iraq. In addition, large groups of Syriacs, Assyrians, and Armenians moved outside of the region to the Americas, the southern states of the USSR, and to Europe. In the process, they created ever-expanding transnational networks with nodes both in their places of origin and throughout the rest of the world. These nodes and networks that were created in the interwar years made use of trajectories to expatriate communities that were established in the 19th and 20th century. Then too, violence and social pressure played a role in stimulating migration, though long-standing commercial networks and contact in the Christian world were just as important. Thus, it is no surprise that these transnational networks play a role in many of the contributions to this book, where they essentially represent a principal theme. When one reads articles in this book from the perspective of one that is inclined to assume that the rapid expansion of these transnational networks often impeded the further development of common ground that provides space for discussions about the common good. Transnational space that the Iraqi Jews created for themselves, in which they were culturally, familiarly, commercially, and religiously bound to Asia, Palestine, England, and France and America, made it easier to disconnect themselves from Iraq with societal pressures increased. Similarly, for the Assyrians from Haqqari, whose ties were to Russia, Lebanon, Europe, and America dated from before the First World War. The situation was somewhat different for the Catholics in Jerusalem and Palestine at large. While the connections to the French Catholic world initially may have held them back in their identification with Arab and Palestinian nationalism, in later decades, these wider Catholic networks stimulated their identification with the region rather than the West in general or France in particular. Thus, depending on the further religious and political developments within these networks, they either grew into alternative communities or into support structures for local identification, though overall the Catholic and Protestant networks might have been more effective in stimulating local rootedness. In the end, its effects are the same as with other transnational networks. The mere existence of such networks made the communities vulnerable to accusations of disloyalty to the state, while at the same time, these networks increased the access of communities and opportunities outside of the region. So effectively, what we're trying to understand here is, before you can say the First World War, even amid the Tanzimat reforms, which tried to really demarcate and understand these regions as formalized millets, the Christians effectively had been assimilated into the, you can say, the Ottoman and sort of Muslim structures so well, that to the point there was almost this syncretism that was emerging within these groups. There were, however, major exceptions, which I've noted here. However, the minute you have all of these sort of great social upheavals, when you have the Armenian genocide, when you have the Russian Revolution, and where all of these groups, so for example, the Assyrians, their largest population is what we would now consider Eastern Kurdistan in the modern boundaries of Turkey. Now they are moving wholesale into Iraq, where only a few villages have really existed before in the Nineveh Plains, and also in Syria around the region of Raqqa. So there is fundamentally a question of how can we create a situation for Christians where they have an identity which is, say, for example, distinct from Israel in Palestine, where they had existed there for thousands of years. And indeed, how can we then assert the idea of an Assyrian nation when the Assyrian people themselves are effectively refugees? So there is essentially a problem in creating roots for a society which is effectively forced to be refugees as a result of the First World War, and also an issue in terms of being able to identify a nation for groups that have already existed there for centuries. So in all senses, you can say, with the exception of Lebanon right from the beginning, the Christians have this, you can say, fundamental disadvantage when it comes to Arab nationalism devolving into Muslim nationalism, and when it comes to Zionism effectively evolving into the actualization, the creation of a Jewish state. And as mentioned, the idea that all of a sudden these connections that are brought around elsewhere, like in Iraq, they can be reactualized when it comes to identifying with the Jewish home state, with Israel, in the same way that Arabs essentially want to identify Iraq and Syria and Jordan, etc., as all belonging to one grander idea of a Arabian patrimony. Then you add into the complications states such as Saudi Arabia and their interpretation of a Salafist, Wahhabist, fundamentalist Islam, which is fundamentally at odds with the secularist aspirations of many intellectuals, both Muslim and Christian, from Syria and from Iraq. Into all of these, you can say it is fundamentally an evolving situation, what's important to understand, and why the Christians are fundamentally ill-equipped in order to deal with these fundamental realities, fundamental sort of changes that are taking place, evolving into this new reality. If the Arabs and the Muslims aren't necessarily willing to sort of identify or conceive of a political formula in this region, how can the Christians barely conceive of that when they're being such a disadvantage as a result of essentially 1,500 years of being controlled by Muslims? Indeed, even the idea essentially of ruling themselves is a completely novel idea when placed within this context of domination and being treated essentially as a minority group on the one hand, or effectively meshing in with the Arab populations on the other. And indeed, when you look at attempts to form, nationalist groups, etc., say, for example, with the Maronites, it's not enough to assert that one's Christian. One needs to assert that, oh, I'm Phoenician as well, fundamentally, because nationhood has to be associated with an ethnicity, and it has to be focused with the association with the land. So Lebanon becomes Neo-Phoenicia, and the Maronites become the inheritors of that legacy. When it comes to Egypt, for example, the Copts revolt against this idea of Arab nationalism by saying that the Copts are basically the successors of the ancient Egyptians, in the same way that when it comes to Assyrian nationalism, they get around this by appealing to Assyria before Nestorianism. Nestor, of course, is a religious figure from the 4th century, but Assyrianism is this idea of establishing a claim for a people which goes all the way back to the first millennia BC, when we talk about Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It is an identification with place, and it's an identification with ethnicity. Christians basically need to tackle these concepts which are emerging out of the French Revolution and form nations. And it is clear that when the State of Israel was created in 1948, the Jews have been able to conceive of such a structure. The Arabs have more or less failed, which is why the divisions still exist today between the Arabian states, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. But the Christians have failed fundamentally in terms of being able to adapt to this new situation.
The only thing I would add to that is that in addition to the very real nature of these challenges that you mentioned, and the unsuitability in many respects of basic nationalist ideas to the reality on the ground, as it were, there is also the idea of methodical, systematic efforts undertaken with malice aforethought, if you will, to exaggerate divisions, and other cases to remove them. So if you take a look at Lebanon, it seems very clear that Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration and all the rest of that show us that there was a major move made to put into place a Jewish state and we know, for example, that the how there was no Kurdistan drawn into the Sykes-Picot arrangements, or there's certainly no such Kurdistan eventuated out of those arrangements. They created sort of perforations that extend into Iran, that extend into Turkey, that extend across Syria.
Kurdistan, though, is another example of this. I haven't mentioned the Kurds, but the Kurds are, again, they are actually a more coherent, and you can say a more successful iteration vis-a-vis the Assyrians, because the Kurds and the Assyrians occupy the same position. But the Kurds and their aspirations for statehoods are far, far more advanced than the case for Christian nationalism or Assyrianism within this region. So even within this context, I talk about, a succession of successes and failures when it comes to Zionism, when it comes to Pan-Arabism. Kurdistan, for all you can say the artificial barriers that have been created to, say, for example, separate the Kurdish patrimony in terms of ethnicity from Iran, from northern Iraq, and from southeastern Turkey, the population and the conception of territory, even if it is stateless, technically, it's far more advanced than anything we see from the Christians.
Yes, no doubt. What I was hoping to underscore there was the point that the Kurds had been left in the state that they were in so that they could be used as a lever later, if necessary, by Western powers to tear apart the very nations that they overlap, which we saw, in bright and shining colors in 2010 in Syria. So when we look at the situation of the Christians and the sort of natural problems that they have, or historical problems, we've also got this overlay of potentially of people attempting to exacerbate these very problems that you went through in order to suit themselves. So look at how Lebanon is an absolute mess. Much of that is historical, but there are ways in the past that things could have been done to sort that out to some extent, which you understand and have researched much more thoroughly than I. But look at Israel by comparison, where Israel sees the ethnic mix on its own territory as being the most threatening thing that it confronts, which is why they appear to be attempting to push what is called the Palestinian population out of Gaza and the West Bank entirely. And so it seems to me that at the same time that these plans were being made, it probably suited some of the people making those plans to leave Lebanon a mess so that it could be more effectively subverted or repressed, suppressed, etc.
It's quite prescient, I think, just to finish this article, because it more or less covers the ground that you brought up. In the period following World War II, the benefits of this migration went both ways in transnational connections, transcultural skills that came with it serving the Christian communities in the Middle East. When in the 1960s and 1970s, Arab countries were eager to take further steps on the road of cultural and economic westernization, it was often the Christians that functioned as cultural brokers. And again, this is a facet which is very similar to the Phanariotes and the Byzantine connections, say, for example, with the Ottomans in the wider West. So this is a tried and true tradition that we see, all the way going back really from the 12th century when the Greeks employed Italians. So, the fact that this still exists in the 20th century with the Christian connection is interesting. Christians were relatively well educated and much more acquainted with Western mores, habits, and they spoke the languages of the West as well as the language of the region in literal and metaphoric ways. More so, say, for example, when it comes to the Maronites. As a result, they occupied crucial and highly visible positions in public life, education, journalism, music, literature, arts and science, and medicine, thus contributing actively and publicly to the creation of a common ground. From the late 1970s onwards, however, this fragile equilibrium started to break down. The Christian positions as cultural brokers was challenged by the double effect of quickly growing, well-educated Muslim middle class that competed for the same jobs in societies that increasingly looked in other directions than Europe and America for ideological inspiration. At the same time, political instability in the region made for increased migration of Christian communities. Palestinian Christians followed their co-religionists to America after the War of 1967, when Israel occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Massive migration from Lebanon started in 1975, when the Christians and Muslims fled the devastation wrought by the civil war. Coptic Christians started to leave Egypt in the 1970s onwards, first to other places in the Middle East, then also to Americas, Europe, Australia, Africa. Meanwhile, the small Syriac community from Turkey was caught in the war between the Turks and the PKK, who, of course, the Kurds. From 1990 onwards, political and economic pressure pressured Iraq's Christians to migrate, seeing ever-increasing numbers from 2003. All of this did not immediately break down the community between Christians and Muslims that had been created in the first part of the 20th century. Much of the structures and places of the encounter remained intact. The combination, however, of cultural marginalization of Christians with the increased political clout of the diaspora communities made for a different dynamic, both within the Christian communities and between them and the rest of society. It is then the concept of minority again becomes important. For the first time, also, those communities, for the most part of the 20th century, resisted the label of minority, seeing themselves as part of a majority community of Arabs, Greeks, Copts, Orthodox, Greek Catholics. Effectively, you can say this is all essentially a part of seeing one less as part of a religious minority to be persecuted, and seeing one essentially as part of ethnicity in the case of Arabs before one talks about religious distinctions. And indeed, you can say this is the current scenario which is taking place in Britain, however, in reverse. As has been recently described by an academic, Sabbah Mahmood, the complex interplay of realizing that the equal rights that had been expected never fully materialized, the pressures of minority discourses originating in diaspora communities and international organizations, and internal Middle Eastern rhetoric about the state all contributed to the de facto minoritization of those Christians that differ from the displaced by various wars, have never left their countries of origin, have always been loyal supporters of the Arab states. So regardless of the pretensions of Christians and their desire essentially to assimilate into these various groups, they have never been able to resist the idea of this sense of otherness, essentially, that they are effectively a conduit to foreign nations and foreign powers. This conception was so strong, say, for example, in the minds of the Ottomans in the late 19th century, that when we see the rise of Abdul Hamid II and his Hamidian regiments, the association of Christians was explicitly to act as the playthings of foreign powers in terms of divvying up these states. In the case, you can say, of Christians, that idea or that sort of phobia is massively sort of accelerated when it comes to the war on terror, so-called, with the Iraq War in 2003 onwards. But finally, Semiagog, I want to come back to the question that you brought up earlier, because that really is, by way of just looking at the Christian situation in the round in the Middle East throughout this period. We'll get more into Lebanon a bit later, but then we come to the question of Israel as a consideration for Christians. And as you can probably see with what's going on today, Israel is a fanatical, it is an obsessive consideration for some Christians. And you mentioned the connection between Protestants and Jews in a way that these Christian groups are not. And so, in terms of understanding this partisanship for American Protestants specifically, in terms of their investment in Zionism, Christian Zionism, the state of Israel, and Jews more, more sort of globally, that really is a novelty in terms of understanding the relationships between, Jewish Jews and Christians in this region from 1948 onwards, in a way that the situation didn't really exist before 1920, before the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now, this is an article by Yaakov, Ariel, Israel and Contemporary Evangelical Christian Millennial Thought, and it's a very good article. I very much enjoyed reading it, and all the links and the citations are found in the description. So just to start off, the millennial vision, and millennial, of course, is the idea and the foundation of the new millennium, which is supposed to effectively be the end of the temporal realm, the domain of, of man, and the arrival, essentially, of the kingdom of God. The millennial vision, which has served as the incentive for the interest of contemporary evangelical Christians in Zionism and Israel, draws on the messianic imagery that goes back to earlier generations of Christianity and has been inspired by passages in biblical texts such as Daniel and the revelation of St. John, or John the Apostle. Interesting that he uses that rather than... Anyway, many Christian groups have become a millennial, expecting the return of Jesus in a remote future and interpreting biblical passages with messianic overtones as allegorical as Augustine did in his City of God. However, millennial groups who were expected the return of Jesus to earth arose during the Middle Ages with the wake of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Reading the Old Testament in a new manner, a number of Protestant groups came to view the Jews as playing an important role in the event of the end times. In contrast to traditional Christian perceptions, a number of Reformed thinkers in France, Reformed being Calvinist, Holland and Britain, and their colonies in the New World, had begun relating to Jews as the heirs of biblical Israel. The rise of the Puritan movement also contributed to the spread of messianic hopes in England and its colonies, with a number of thinkers relating to the Jews and the prospect of their renewal as a nation, their conversion to Christianity, and their settlement in Palestine. Again, emphasizing the point you brought up earlier, Semigog, about the connection with England specifically and English Protestantism to the Jews. Such messianic hopes played a part in the deliberations on the return of the Jews to England in 1655. That was during Cromwell. Likewise, Reformed Protestants in Britain and Holland followed the interests in the Jewish Messianic movement, stirred on by one Shabbatai Zvi in the mid-17th century, hoping that it will bring about the return of the Jews to Palestine. It was already at this stage that one could notice characteristics of Christian interest in the Jewish return to Palestine on behalf of these Messianic hopes. Such messianically oriented Christians tended to read the Christian sacred scriptures in a more literal manner, and in contrast to other branches of Christianity. Many of them saw the Jews as heirs to the covenant between God and Abraham, and the object of biblical prophecies about a restored Davidic kingdom in the land of Israel. In their messianic scenarios, the return of the Jews to Palestine was a necessary step in the advancement of the messianic timetable. Although their image of the Jews was often mixed and reflected some of their cultural stereotypes of Jews in Christian and European societies. Again, interesting to note, as I brought up with the fundamental strange Arab and Assyrian nature and the Levantine constructs essentially that the Europeans had about these Christians, and the limitations, you can say, of the ecumenism inherent, say, for example, in the foreign policy ambitions of Britain and America in particular. It's interesting, isn't it, that its proximity to the Jews in Europe that actually, you can say, allows for the Jews within the mindset coming out of the 17th century and the creation, you can say, of the commercial empires, that actually puts the Jews from a cultural point of view in a relatively good state, say, for example, as acting as part, you can say, of a civilizing European force compared to these backward heretical subsects of Christians. Do you think there's some validity in that view?
Yes, insofar as I have my head around all of this, which is a vast topic. It certainly seems that in some sense a decision was made more recently than the earlier stuff you're talking about here, or that is mentioned in the article here. It seems in some sense a decision was made to basically sweep the table and remove all these Christian client populations, which created so many issues between the great powers. Are we going to talk about the Orthodox or the Armenians with Russian backing, or the Catholics with French, or this sort of thing? It seems as though the West in its entirety has somehow made a decision to drop the Christian client populations in the Middle East as a lever, and to replace them with the Jews. And I can see certainly reasons why, here I'm speaking mostly about the United States and Britain, but of course, you can look at the kind of statements made by the EU about issues in Israel and compare them with, the relative lack of interest, other than, superficial acting out as regards the safety and thriving of Christian communities in the East. And we could see that underscored with what is going on in Armenia, where we likewise have a very strong diaspora population with certainly political leverage in the United States and France, where you've got a Christian population that has just been ethnically cleansed from one of its historical regions by Muslims, with the support not just of the Turks, but with the support of the Israelis, because it geopolitically suits the Israelis, among other reasons, to have an ally to the north of Iran, to kind of hem it in. So yeah, yes, I can see this being a kind of substitution of the Jews for these other populations. I wonder what you think about that idea. It certainly allows the West to focus its attention on one group. And as I started to say, but I allowed my train of thought to distract me. This certainly suits Jewish Zionists because it makes them fundamentally the tool of Western foreign policy in terms of keeping the Middle East from coalescing as a power block of its own, of agitating the region and keeping it in a state of where it can never settle in and become successful.
Just to answer this comment in the chat, look at Pakistan. um, I would actually push back against this idea and say you're jumping the gun a little bit, because what I find remarkable about this perception is that there is really no conception, or you can say a Jewish concept of Zionism in the 17th century, which is imperialistic in the way of exploiting the differences between these groups and using it to undermine the institutions of the Ottoman Empire. It's really the main two powers who are thinking imperialistically about this region are using Christians. They are using the Orthodox communities in the case of Russia, and they're using the Catholic communities in the case of France, even as late as the 19th century, when Napoleon III came in, intervened in the Crimean. Yep, sorry.
Sorry if I was unclear. I meant that very recently, following World War or through the second half of World War
I. I understand that, but what I'm saying is,
sorry, then I'll listen.
No, what I'm trying to underscore here is that in the 17th century, this is purely idealistic, is what I'm trying to contrast with nowadays. Yes, you're seeing perhaps the consideration for Jews vis-a-vis the West. And what I'm saying is that even at that time, those considerations that you brought up applied to powers that were existing, the Catholics in France and the Orthodox in Russia, but it did not exist in the minds of people like Cromwell. It did not exist in the minds of, say, for example, the Jews and the early sort of American pioneers. So what I'm really trying to emphasize, as will become apparent when it comes to the relationship between the evangelicals and the Jews, is that you can say there is something far more religious and fanatical about this association that really exists with the other client groups. So I'll continue. In addition to groups of Reformed Protestants, members of the Pietist movement, that's a Lutheran subsect, that gained influence in the 17th and 18th centuries in Central and Northern Europe, they held to this millennial vision of history. 17th century, yes, I'm talking about the period of Cromwell, Comstock. They took an interest in the Jews and the prospect of their conversion and eventual rejuvenation as a nation in the land of Israel. Pietists were pioneers of missions to the Jews, as well as proponents of Jewish emancipation, and they served as a model to evangelical groups that came to be in the English-speaking world. Belief in the imminent second coming of Jesus and the prospect of Jewish restoration resurfaced with much vigor in the early decades of the 19th century, with the rise of the evangelical movement in Britain and a new wave of fascination with this prophecy. Israel looms large in this catastrophic millennial vision. With catastrophic events will affect the entire universe. Israel, the country, and its people will serve as the focal point of this apocalyptic era. An end times ground zero. It will be in Jerusalem that Antichrist will reign and re-establish the temple and its sacrifices, and it will be in the valley of Megiddo in northern Israel that the battles between Gog and Magog will take place. The land of Israel will become the aim of the four invading empires. Jesus' arrival on earth with his saints, the true Christian believers, will take place on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Temple Mount. Likewise, Jesus will reign from Jerusalem, David's eternal capital, over the global millennial kingdom. In contrast to this traditional Christian view of the Jews as people whose role in history had terminated after Jesus' sacrifice and the rise of Christianity, evangelicals have come to see the Jews as a people who are about to resume their position as God's first nation. So I brought that up again as to associate that this is, I'm not sure if you watch Alistair Crook quite a lot, but this is an eschatological vision coming from a Christian perspective that has been superimposed upon Israel. And what the evangelicals do is take that further, and they eschew, you can say, this idealized notion in the 18th and 17th century about the conversion of the Jews and almost seeing them as a Christian peoples repeopling in a European fashion those regions in Palestine and the Davidic kingdom. But rather here, we are taking that and going one step further, and it will be the unbaptized Jews who effectively will instead be the accelerators of this Zionistic process, which means that the evangelicals are reaching a stage. You can see that eschatology has reached a stage where they're actually sort of going beyond the Christian provisions when it comes to conversion and baptism, which makes them so significant within this sort of grand scheme of history in terms of looking at this as some sort of, again, it's very difficult to look at what's going on today and the state of Israel and look at the Zionists in America and see these people as solely focused on material aims and imperial aims. You know, I'm rather adept in terms of being able to pass and understand imperial connections when it comes to populations and subversions of territory. Is what I think makes the end of the Ottoman Empire so fascinating to you and myself, Semiagog. But compare, you can say, the murderous indifference of the British towards the Assyrians and see from here the bubbling up of this grand eschatological horrifying vision that the Christians from Britain and America are beginning to conceive, and see fundamentally where their interests are going to lie and how this sort of builds up to, you can say, the motivations of various actors behind the Balfour Declaration.
Yeah, nothing to add there.
The evangelical millennial scenario and the places Jews occupy in the evangelical messianic faith can well explain the interest in numerous evangelical groups and individuals that have shown in the Jews and the prospect of their national restoration. Beginning in the 19th century, evangelicals holding to such pre-millennialist convictions, whether historicist or futurist, have come up with a series of initiatives intended to bring about the promise of a national restoration of the Jews in Palestine. Such efforts were predated the rise of political Zionism, consisted of trying to persuade the British, German, or American governments to intercede with the international community and the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which ruled Palestine at the time, and proposed the creation of the Jewish homeland in that land. So going back to Commonwealth in that land, so going back to your connection about imperial connections, if there is an imperial angle, especially for the American and British governments, it comes much, much later, and we see that connection between the Russians and the Catholics with France. But nevertheless, that connection does exist. But I do really want to emphasize the religious vision coinciding with that. One of the noted initiatives was that of William Blackstone, a Methodist businessman from Chicago, who had adopted the dispensationalist premillennialist faith in the 1870s and became an evangelist and promoter of this brand of messianic faith. His book, Jesus is Coming, became an evangelical and dispensationalist. And again, dispensationalism is one of these millennialist and sort of eschatological schools of theory coming out. I mean, it goes all the way back to the same things we're talking about, you know, the roots in the Protestant Reformation and the 17th century. Moreover, however, it goes on to evolve into, say, for example, a cohesive, more or less cohesive methodology when it comes to biblical exegesis in the 19th century. His book, Jesus is Coming, became an evangelical and dispensationalist bestseller translated into numerous languages. In it, Blackstone tried to persuade the readers of the details of the dispensationalist faith and the centrality of the Jews in God's plans for humanity. Blackstone visited Palestine in 1889 and was deeply impressed by the developments that the first wave of Zionist immigration had brought about in that country that he considered to be so desolated. And again, this is coming off the back of the creation of the Beirut Vilayet, the French intervention, post-Crimean War, and Western investment and renewed interest in that region. He viewed the agricultural settlements and the new neighborhoods in Jerusalem as signs of the time, indications that the current era was ending, and the great events of the end times were to occur very soon. Blackstone devised a theory that has become the cornerstone for American evangelical premillennialists committed to a Jewish restoration. The United States, the American evangelists asserted, had a special role and mission in God's plan for humanity, that of a modern Cyprus, to help restore the Jews to Zion. A modern Cyrus. Maybe a modern Cyprus is also appropriate because of the connection between the Lusignan dynasty and the restoration of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but that's another connection. Of course, a modern Cyrus in the sense that Cyrus was the one ultimately to end the Babylonian captivity of the Jews and ultimately restore the Jews to their place in the Levant, which would ultimately evolve into the Herodian kingdom around the time of Christ. Right. God has chosen America for this mission on account of its moral superiority over other nations and will judge America according to the way it carries out its mission. His theory enabled American evangelicals to combine their messianic faith and understanding of the course of human history with their sense of American patriotism. And again, this idea of the intermingling association between the United States' grand plans for humanity, manifest destiny, civilizing mission, and the association with Zionism as an emanation of American patriotism. This in the late 19th century, what does that remind you of, Semi-Cock? Recently, I saw a tweet from the governor of Montana saying Montana stands with Israel, and I saw Lindsey Graham in response to the areas affected by the recent hurricane in South Carolina, saying, yes, the situation in South Carolina is regrettable, but look what's happening over in Israel.
Horrifying, yes.
When Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, began his efforts in 1896 to secure international recognition for the idea of a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine, pre-millennialist evangelicals, both historicists and dispensationalists, showed much interest in the new movement and offered support. For example, William Heckler, a German-British pietist evangelical believer in this historicist vision of the Christian faith, became an advisor to Herzl and his liaison to the Protestant rulers of Germany. So again, this ancient connection between the evangelicals and the first pioneers of secular Zionism from the Jewish point of view. Some of the characteristics of the relationship between this messianically inclined Christian support and the Zionist leadership were laid down at this time. As a rule, Zionist leaders did not understand this theology and viewed it as somewhat eccentric conviction, focusing instead on the ways that it practically could support their cause. And again, I look at that, and I think again, these idiots, these theologians with their mad theories about the Jews having to return as a nation in order to prop up some sort of Zionist precondition for the establishment of the Third Temple, which will bring about again the rapture in the Protestant conception and the end times. The Jews, rather pragmatically, they look at these considerations and say, well, the American Christians, the British, all of these evangelicals, these Protestants, they've worked themselves up into this dispensationalist vision of the future, which is predicated around our secular political project. So we might as well exploit them. We don't need to understand them so long as they support us. And really, you can say that that forms the bedrock for the bipartisan American coalition, which supports effectively the Zionist project. From the Republican point of view, it is this evangelical eccentricity, and from the secular vision of the Democrats, it's due to, say, for example, the over-indexing of various Jews within the whole hierarchy of the party. So again, going back to this idea of the connectedness between American evangelicals and Zionism, this predates the creation of the State of Israel, and it goes back all the way to its ideological origins in the late 19th century.
Yes, and some deeper ones that are less directly connected to the later Zionism, as of course the article makes clear, and you mentioned their earlier antecedents, but they don't mesh politically with the desires of groups that are in power, and just so people get this. The goal here is not to just hammer on Jews in a discussion about Lebanon. It's to attempt to get some sense, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, AM, of how it is that we see an increasing lack of concern at best for what happens to Christians in the Middle East, and how it is that a large proportion of Christians in the United States, in any case, are behind efforts and movements that continue to erode the position of Christians in the Middle East.
Well, I mean, in the case of Britain, we have an entirely secularist foreign policy as it pertains to relation to Christianity. Indeed, the Anglican Church has spurred on any connection between you could say the sanctification of Britain's secularist foreign policy. You can go all the way back to the 1960s in terms of understanding how the Church of England has no interest in terms of propping up Christianity. But regards specifically to the element of Lebanon, which you bring up, Semigog, this is fundamental. As the Christian element within foreign policy across the West fades away, all of a sudden the major foreign policy consideration as it becomes to Christians in the West becomes the American evangelicals. By the time of 1967 and the 7 Days War, you can say the only major political figure sort of acting as a brake against this Protestant American domination when it comes to Christian influence on foreign policy is de Gaulle. And funnily enough, who gets conveniently color revolutioned around the time of the 7 Days War? It's none other than de Gaulle. And with the fall of de Gaulle comes a dramatic reduction of French influence within the world, albeit it still tries to prop up this Gaullist mantra. And in particular, you can say the last serious connection that France has in terms of acting as a countervailing influence upon the state of Israel, this period between 1967 up until de Gaulle's resignation in 1969. And the reason I bring that up, of course, is that the Maronite connection is explicitly made to the Catholic French connection. Yeah, that is essentially the reason Lebanon even exists as a nation within the construct of the French Mandate, and how it became distinct fundamentally from Syria and indeed from Palestine, going back to the interventions within the 1860s and looking at this idea of the explicit Catholic association with the Maronites. Now that is failing as a foreign policy consideration. Now instead it is the evangelicals with their Zionist vision, effectively, which has now gone beyond the impetus towards conversion and baptism that is informing events. And thereby you can see from a Christian point of view in the West, there's already been a process of othering, of creating an Oriental complex for the Christians who are not part of the Protestant, Catholic, even Orthodox considerations, the Nestorians, the Miaphysites, the Copts, et cetera, which also obviously has an ethnic component, but of course it has a religious component. And mentioning the fact that what made Israelis and Jews and Zionism so amenable to the populations of the Protestants in the West is due to their European proximity, essentially, to them. They were, weirdly enough, the Jews in Europe were far less of a differentiation between other Europeans than the Eastern Christians were. So within this whole sort of grand conception, you can say that there are elements of, of European colonialism, obviously, that come from 1948, and the idea essentially of turning Israel into a European nation, a European colony, effectively, within the East. And even from that standpoint, you can say the Maronites figure less prominently, because even though the Maronites are in communion with the Catholic Church, they are far more disconnected in terms of all their cultures and traditions and religious practices from the rest of Catholic Christendom, especially with that of France. So that is essentially the basis that we can understand, that as soon as the power backers in the East change, as the influence of France decreases, as Catholicism becomes a secondary consideration, as we have the rise of Arab nationalism and the rise of Zionism, this becomes the fundamental sort of foreign policy goal, the idea of Jewish exceptionalism and Zionism as a grand overarching factor. So moving on from this article, the Six-Day War had a dramatic effect on American evangelicals. Since the French Revolution in the last years of the 18th century, there had probably not been a political military event that provided so much fuel to the engines of this Christian millennial belief as did the short war between Israel and its neighbors in June of 1967. Effectively in 1948, Israel is invaded by all of its neighbors, effectively. There are still countries in the Middle East who are still technically at war with Israel, and Israel takes this very seriously, as we're seeing nowadays. In that process, Israel was able to establish a territory which went far beyond the territory which was originally established for in the partition, and it meant immediately from 1948 that the goal of a Palestinian state was effectively denied. In 1967, this goes a step further. The Israelis launch a preemptive strike, which involves the occupation of the West Bank, the encirclement of Gaza, and the occupation of the Sinai Peninsula. Such gains which would only be reversed slightly later in 1973 when we have the War of Yom Kippur. Nevertheless, we're talking about the consolidation, you can say, of the Israeli state, and why 1967 is such a pivotal moment in terms of not just survival, in terms of the conception of the perpetuation of Zionism also, but in terms of escalation and reorientation of West, how it views the Arabic secularist states, and how effectively Israel, which had previously been drawn to the goals of the Soviet Union from about 1953 up until 1967, all of a sudden the evangelical factor, which of course had always been a factor, becomes one of the prevailing factors, which allows for the US to become a principal and ultimately, you can say, nearly unconditional backer of Israel's foreign policy. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yes. Yes.
The dramatic Israeli victory and the territorial gains it brought with it strengthened the evangelical pre-millennialist conviction that Israel was to play an important role in developments that were preceding the arrival of the Messiah. Since the 1970s, the conservative evangelicals have become Israel's most ardent supporters in the American public arena. Likewise, the growing evangelical population in Latin America, again, this is an important consideration, the rise of Protestantism, which, due to the sort of the missionary efforts, is actually far more effective than, you say, the more complacent attitudes of Catholics who have been there for centuries. And other parts of the world have often joined the ranks of Christians who hold favorable positions towards Israel. Such Christians involved themselves in the 1970s in Jewish causes, such as the demand through the 1980s to facilitate Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union. And again, immigration is an important factor in terms of understanding why Israel and its foreign policy was oriented towards the Soviet Union, given the fact that as we have Jews, Israelis who were there, again, commingling with the Muslims and Christians for thousands of years, many from the late 19th century up until the 20th century were groups coming from America, coming from Europe, coming from Russia. And indeed, the ethnic consideration, that connection between Russia, and the idea essentially that the Soviet Union were fighting an anti-fascist, pro-Jewish war against the Holocaust and against German Nazism. All of this, again, was to buttress the association between Israel and the USSR. But interestingly enough, again, as we have the more sort of secularist, socialist, the kibbutz-esque association with the USSR, when we talk about the right as it exists within Israel, the conservative Orthodox Jewish right, of which Netanyahu is fundamentally leading the coalition at this moment. This, of course, allows us to understand how Israel could effectively flip effectively some sort of Wittgensteinian Gestalt switch between the Soviet Union in the early 1960s and the US in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in terms of understanding this as a broader facet within the Cold War. The decades following the war in 1967, marked by massive American support for Israel in terms of money, arms, and diplomatic backing, for many conservative Christians in America, their premillennialists motivated pro-Israel stance meshed with an appreciation of the importance of the State of Israel within the Cold War struggles between America and the Soviets, and later the fight against Muslim terrorists. The same year saw a dramatic rise in evangelical influence in America. Growing in numbers and self-confidence, evangelicals have become one of the most important political, cultural camps in the United States and beyond. A friendly attitude towards Israel has been part and parcel of the evangelical vision of America's global policy. Since the late 1970s, as the pro-Israeli influence of the premillennialist evangelical groups on American political life has become more apparent, the Israeli government has taken more notice of this segment of Christianity and has initiated measures to establish contact with conservative evangelical Christians in order to cultivate their support. Among other things, Menachem Begin, I can't pronounce that, I think it's Begin, appointed a special liaison for evangelical Christians in the Prime Minister's office. Israeli officials spoke at evangelical conferences and met with evangelical leaders and groups as part of the latter's touring schedules in Israel. After the Israeli bombing of the Iraqi atomic plant in 1981, Begin called Jerry Falwell, at the time the leader of the conservative group in the moral majority and an ardent premillennialist, and asking him to back Israel. Since the 1980s, Israeli officials have relied on Christian evangelical leaders and groups to reach conservative American Protestants and to help create an atmosphere of understanding and support for Israel and its agenda. Now, this is a history of today's Semigog. Do you have anything to point out in terms of examples that we can draw to what's going on today?
Well, I wasn't quite ready for that. I was thinking more broadly about geopolitics. Does something come to mind that you can tease some of this out from me?
Oh, I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek. I was pointing to, so for example, when we had the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, speaking at a conference of American evangelicals, and this sort of rhetoric almost being not necessarily prosaic, but formulaic in terms of these mantras and everything that we've been seeing since October the 7th being played out every time in terms of being able to support the state of Israel and its agenda. It really is rather remarkable to see how long essentially this relationship goes back, and again, underscoring and cementing this idea essentially of Christianity and the state of Israel and the American conception, the American Protestant evangelical conception being one and the same. Again, I bring all of this up because this is fundamental in terms of understanding how Christians, by extension, have become inconvenient towards this, this conception of foreign policy and geopolitics. Because, as I mentioned, all the way going back from the dissolution, yes, Eisenhower pursued a fundamentally different foreign policy in the 1950s that was pro-NASA and pro sort of Arab unification, but fundamentally that all changed in the late 1960s, 1970s. So yes, I bring all of this up essentially to establish that how can we understand the pivotal nature of Jews vis-a-vis Christians in the Middle East? And when you consider that the greatest Christian exponents in terms of their actual influence on tangible effects in power politics are the American evangelicals, I think you can understand why other Christian sects and a broader sense of Christian ecumenism becomes not just, you can say, not a secondary factor, but not a factor at all in these considerations.
Yes, it's an interesting story about power politics, because if I remember correctly, there was a brief time under Napoleon where France attempted to make a play for Jewish allegiance. If I remember correctly, it was related to.
In fairness, Napoleon did actually come to the Middle East. Napoleon went to Egypt. Napoleon invaded Syria, and really, you can say actually the Napoleonic project was a precursor of secular Arab nationalism, and I do mean that sincerely, because the French came over and they tried to create the Christians and the Arabs living in Egypt and the Levant as effectively part of one nation, which is essentially to exist under the protection of France. You can say it was basically a precursor to a French mandate, and it's obvious that you can say the ideas of this Napoleonic intervention and French liberalism and liberalism more broadly are especially appealing, and the precedent essentially begins with Napoleon there.
Yes, and then we see with the Germans, as some of our Jewish listeners may know, but those who are not Jewish probably won't know. Well, many of them will know, but the center of gravity of early Zionism was certainly in German-speaking countries. Absolutely.
But by German-speaking countries, you mean really Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course, Herzl.
Yes, I shouldn't say specifically countries. Yes, and so that was manifestly the center of that movement. And the Zionist movement began to get traction in the United States. But with World War One, you had Jews fighting in the German military and holding positions of authority. And I believe the sense I get from the research I've done is that the Jews of the diaspora, across the world and in the United States, were not in any kind of rush to alienate Germany, because, first off, the Germans were fighting against the Russians, and the Russians were not treating Jews well at this time and hadn't been known for it in the past. And, during World War One, and the Germans, the Russians had not been known for treating the Jews well, and the Germans were at least being more even-handed in their treatment of the different populations in Eastern Europe by comparison with the Russians. Also, at that time, there were early settlements in Palestine, and the Germans were allied with the Ottomans, and the Ottomans were the ones who had been blocking further Jewish immigration to the area. And so the German Jews, and here read the center of gravity of the Zionist movement, figured that they had good chances with Germany and their Ottoman allies after the war. If they played ball, they could see their hopes and aspirations for a Jewish state in the region move forward. And in my view, what we see with the Balfour Declaration is a move made by the Brits to bring the Americans into the war, and I believe to some extent international and American Jewish figures with quite a bit of money and influence in the United States had to some extent been blocking that. And with the Balfour Declaration, these powerful international Jewish forces saw that they had a commitment from the West to move their project forward, and they had been watching how the World War I was going. And so the Balfour Declaration comes in, and the negotiations for that were earlier, starting in 1916, I believe, late 1916, if not earlier, mainly, what's his name, Chaim Weizmann, if I'm pronouncing that right. But basically, they come along, and with the Balfour Declaration, they say, hey, we will give you the best chance, the best commitment to give you a state in the region. And so that led the Jews in the United States, who were Zionists, I believe, to lift their veto and move forward with everything with Wilson and the Americans entering the war, with which the Brits desperately needed. So you can see from that perspective how it worked for British interests. And we can also see how it also sort of put a debit into the German column while moving it over as a credit into the column of the Allies. So it would suit British interests, and it would suit Jewish interests, certainly Zionist interests as well. So this by way of background, stating that this isn't all just a story about Jews doing things. It's how they do things in alliance with countries like Britain and the United States. And I think that there's a further aspect of this which I don't yet know enough about, but in some sense, I think the Zionist Jews in Israel and some of them elsewhere felt that they had been cheated after World War I, because they did not get what they had actually asked for, what they thought that they would get from the British after World War I ended. And then with the United States, a country that seems to have made an even greater commitment to Israel, I think they still don't feel that they've gotten what they wanted, which was a Jewish homeland. And instead, what they have is a country that is, deeply divided. And with, as many people have observed, if the Palestinian birth rates continue as they're going, and if it were just a straight up, democracy in Israel, the Palestinians in short order would be outvoting the Jews. So here we see a move on the part of Netanyahu at present, in keeping with a long-term Israeli policy, to introduce, let's put it as charitably as possible, to introduce homogeneity into the region. And so there is this interesting aspect. I talked before about how fragmented a country like Lebanon is because of the different groups within it. But we see that in some sense, that same sort of foreign policy approach has been taken first by the British and then subsequently by the Americans, perhaps less so, permitting the settlements and the rest. But it has been undertaken towards Israel as well, keeping these various states from properly coalescing. It seems that they will tolerate stability in Egypt. But otherwise, Western powers continuously hammer, and certainly in Saudi Arabia, but for the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Iraq, and if they had their way, all the way up into Iran. And if you look at the Sykes-Picot agreement stuff with the Kurds, as I said, being sort of like spread across Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey, there are plans that were laid long ago, apparently, by Western foreign policy people to be able to split up everything from Iran all the way down to Israel in the south.
I think there are a lot of points you can bring up. I think, though, what I'm really trying to underscore here is that when we talk about the Balfour Declaration, effectively, one can actually conceive a way in which the Jewish home state, or at least the promise of the Jewish home state, would have arisen regardless of who won the war. Because as the evangelical consideration existed within American foreign policy, the pietist consideration also existed within German foreign policy. Really, you can say Kaiser Wilhelm was, pursuing all sort of grand visions in terms of sort of a religiously motivated foreign policy. On the one hand, he wants to be the protector of all Muslims everywhere and use the Ottomans as some sort of example to realize the grand vision of the restoration of the caliphate. On the other hand, the Austrians and the Germans are the only ones to actually basically force the Ottomans to break off their war on the Assyrian Christians, effectively, allowing them effectively to enter into a ceasefire that would remain even after most of the horrendous atrocities of the Sifo have already occurred. Indeed, given the German connection, I believe that, had the German Empire survived, pressure would have been essentially put upon the Ottoman Empire to conceive of something equivalent of the Jewish home state. It was simply more actionable when we talk about the realities on the ground of the war against the Ottoman Empire in 1916 and 1917. But again, you have the consideration for the Jews, and you pit that against, again, Arab nationalism and Lawrence of Arabia. And essentially the West are playing off all of these forces against one another. They're seeing which client group can essentially accelerate the process of Ottoman decline and victory in World War I. All of this effectively is to say that Jews were a consideration in the post-World War I period. Christians were a much lesser consideration, but they were still a consideration. The state of Lebanon is testament to the fact, especially within French foreign policy, they were permitted essentially to allow for the creation of a Christian majority state, a Christian plurality state within the Middle East, albeit a Christian state which had to power share with the other minorities, the Druze, the Sunnis, and the Shias. But what I'm trying to get across is that with the ascendancy of the American evangelicals, with the two-party backing, I mean, one of the reasons why Jimmy Carter was, reviled so much by Israel is the Democrats were not seen essentially to be as prominent supporters of Israel as the Republicans, and that is going to be a consideration when it comes to the U.S. election, which is going to take place next month. All of this is to say that Israel is now an overbearing, you can say, titanic consideration from the 1970s onwards, in the way that it simply was not back in 1910. You can see the murmurings of this, this Zionist-centered foreign policy. But again, the British were seen as withholding that goal, essentially. There was simmering low-intensity conflict between Zionists and British in the Mandate of Palestine throughout that period. And indeed, remember that the original creation, the partition agreement between Palestine and Israel, envisioned a much, much smaller Israel than what we currently see today, and what ultimately may be the final aspirations of Netanyahu's project. So you can see again that, as you mentioned, this idea of withholding Jewish hopes and aspirations. What we're basically seeing now is, the reductio ad absurdum of that, and how far essentially can Israel's aims be compatible with West. So contrast this. What happened to Lebanon? Where does Lebanon figure in all of this? Because we've been at pains essentially to realize the Jewish exception within this region, how Christian nationalism was never taken seriously in most of the Middle East, and Arab nationalism basically was betrayed in many ways by the provisions of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the fundamental, you can say, contradictions between a Saudi Arabian religiously led state that was spurred on by the US alliance on oil in the 1970s, and the original aspirations between secular pan-Arabism led by Nasser and Ba'athist, and all of these sort of parties emanating from the 1970s, and the idea of the Arab secular renaissance. How does this all configure in Lebanon? Because I come back to the creation of the Colin Associationalist idea in 1943, the power sharing agreement, and wonder essentially, how did this figure within not just Western plans, but within Israel's foreign policy? And unfortunately, you can say that Lebanon is the prime victim of Israel's foreign policy beyond Palestine itself. And the reason I say this effectively is that a while ago, I did a stream on Rhodesia, not a while ago, about a month ago. And something that really caught my eye and actually partly motivated me to follow that up with a stream on apartheid was this notion that Ian Smith viewed the lack of South African support. Indeed, you can say the fact that the South Africans were prepared to throw Rhodesia, off as a sacrificial lamb in the 1970s, from 1974 onwards, was partly as a result of the fundamental ideological contradictions between Rhodesia and its policy of gradualism towards black majority rule, albeit I believed it was never going to happen given, the Ian Smith conception, and the formalization of apartheid, which would have eventually led essentially to a Afrikaner with, a British associated dominated homeland within South Africa. The reason I bring this up is that obviously the connection between South Africa and its policy towards Palestine is clear. What we see with the Bantustans is very similar to how the Israelis have treated Gaza and the West Bank, and how actually Lebanon and this idea of the power sharing agreement and the plurality of Christians is, in many ways, you can say, a reflection of Rhodesia. And so by the 1960s, you have this policy essentially of Lebanon and Israel reflecting a similar dynamic with Rhodesia and South Africa. However, now it comes to the differences. And the difference is that with 1948, with the Nakba, with the aggrandizing, the engorging of the original Israeli state and the flight of the Palestinians, where do a large number of Palestinians go, Oliver? They go into Lebanon.
Jordan and
They go
Lebanon.
into Lebanon. And of course, the power sharing agreement was figured on the 1932 population census. So already you have a consideration of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fleeing into Lebanon, which are upsetting those dynamics. However, in spite of that, the system was so successful. It was basically, you can say that Lebanon from 1948 up until 1975 was essentially conceived of as the Switzerland of the Middle East. And I mean that in multiple senses. It was, obviously a rugged, mountainous, separate region, which no longer saw itself as part of Syria or part of Palestine or the wider Levant. It had major Western connections. It had its own commercial and banking sector.
Yes,
which,
banking particularly. Yes.
Which had arisen from, the original connection all the way to the construction of the Beirut Vilayet some 100 years before. It was a popular tourist destination. And all of this gave rise to the expression that Beirut was the Paris of the East. And the religious distinctions and the multi-confessional sectarian nature essentially led itself to the possibility of establishing a canton system in Lebanon that would again mirror essentially the diffusion, decentralization of political power as we saw, of course, arising in Switzerland after the Napoleonic Wars with the creation of the new Swiss Confederation. So why did this all change? Because again, you can say that Lebanon in the 1950s was a Middle Eastern success story. And Lebanon from the 1980s has been a testament to failed states everywhere, to the point that we even have a name for it, Lebanization. And this idea, again, has been, say, for example, reflected, you can say, most coherently when it comes to the example of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So as with, you can say, the Rhodesia situation, how Rhodesia collapsed and became Zimbabwe, and things in Zimbabwe went, terribly, terribly wrong from about the late 1990s onwards to today. A similar situation happened in Lebanon, albeit the dynamics had changed. And fundamentally, as we see in 1967, which galvanized the American right and the American evangelicals to see basically Israel as, you can say, the engine of divine manifest destiny and approval as a result of the consequence of their victories against seemingly insurmountable odds in such a short period of time. Lebanon is the principal victim of 1967, even though Lebanon and Israel up until this point were allies, even though their political systems were very, very fundamentally different. Because again, as we saw in 1948, the larger number of Palestinian refugees went into Lebanon. And this fundamentally and forever changed the demographic and religious makeup of Lebanon to this day. And all of a sudden, the Palestinians, who had again been driven further underground in 1967, now found themselves leading an insurgency from Lebanon. Essentially, the wider conflict between Palestine and Israel had now been exported to neighboring Lebanon. And essentially, you can say that this has all become part of the broader conflict of Israel, and all of these factors result in the Lebanese civil war in 1975. And what an interesting dynamic that emerges out of the Lebanese civil war in 1975 is that with the, you can say, the failure of this, grand conception of the cantonment system, or the idea of Lebanon being the Paris of the East and representing this tranquil vision of a Middle Eastern Switzerland, the goal now of the Christians is to assert a Maronite independence, or even Maronite dominance over this region that has become part and embroiled within what was previously the internal conflicts of the state of Israel within the conception of Israel versus Palestine paradigm. You can say that a large number of Maronites look to Israel and look to import a version of Christian Zionism, in the sense that the Maronites will be the new Zionistic project, into Lebanon. And as a result, a large number of Maronites become more militant, and they want to imitate the Jewish system. These become part of the Lebanese front, and they are supported by Israel. However, now that this has essentially become a fight for the soul of Lebanon and what Lebanon means, now it has basically become embroiled in this, grander fight essentially for Israel's survival. Lebanon, of course, becomes a secondary consideration in terms of the Maronite Christians effectively being able to predominate and be a plurality in what was essentially a state created for them with that fundamental consideration. As 1975 proved that the Palestinian conflict could escalate and become a larger Middle Eastern conflict, of course, Semigog, what happens in 1979?
Please tell me.
The Iranian Revolution.
Pardon me, I did not jump far enough afield.
Well, again, it's not really far afield at all. I mean, I'm of the not too conspiratorial mindset that Lebanon and Iran and Shia Islam are inseparable. There is a deep ideological, religious, and historical connection between these two regions. When Shah Ismail established the Safavid state in the year 1500, effectively, you can say Iran was, as heterogeneous as Lebanon was. There was a very large Sunni population. And the way to unite Iran around the Shah, but also in opposition to the Ottomans, who were their main adversary for the next several centuries, was to solidify a Iranian Shia identity. And of course, the Shia that ultimately presided over wasn't the Shia of the Safavid religious cult, which was more Sufistic. Instead, it was doctrinaire Twelver Shiism that was imported by Lebanese clerics in the 16th century. So you can say that when the White Shah, and I mean the White Shah in the sense that Mohammad Reza in the 1970s was basically considered a monarch Bolshevik, in the sense that he basically wanted to allow for Iran to become a Western secularist post-religious state. When you look at, say, for example, the Khomeinian revolution and the creation of the Islamic Republic, you can say this is basically a restoration of these ideological and historical links between Lebanon, with its ancient Shiite population, and the new regime in Iran, which now, again, as with the state of Israel, has a eschatological vision, essentially, of uniting and presiding over the protection of Shia Muslims everywhere, a consideration that was not a factor in the policy of Mohammad Reza, the White Shah. So as Christians basically have become a secondary consideration for Zionist foreign policy, as Lebanon basically is cratering and falling apart in the 1970s. With the Iranian Revolution now, the Shiite population ultimately evolves a few years later into Hezbollah. The Jews have to respond in 1982 by occupying a large section of southern Lebanon, basically to perpetuate their hold on this region. But you can say that the damage has already been done irreparably to Lebanon. The power dynamics have been established now. We have a Jewish state which is now supported by America, which is content to establish its Zionist vision, again, very similar to what we see with South Africa, which does not allow for a plurality of Muslim Palestinians to become embroiled in a democratic process over the territory, because that would mean the dissolution of the Zionist project. In the same way, effectively, that the Maronites have now been displaced in their own region, and they no longer represent the predominating factor of the population as they had back in 1932. Lebanon, worse than that in terms of its demographic shift, it has now become nothing more than, as you can say, the plaything in this consideration between the foreign policy imperialist dynamics between Iran and Israel. Iran will support Hezbollah in terms of the perpetuation of its Shiite protection, and Israel effectively will very tentatively support elements of Christians, but even those finally go by the wayside, and Israel pursues, you can say, a harder militaristic goal by the end of the 1990s, towards the year 2000. So yeah, what I'm basically trying to explain is that all of the dynamics that we're currently seeing, as there is the possibility of a major military intervention back into Lebanon from Israel, is that all of these dynamics have played out before in the early 1980s amid the Lebanese Civil War. And most importantly, from the point of view of this discussion, the collapse of, you can say, the only thing resembling a successful Christian majority nationalism within the Middle East.
Yeah, but very interesting, and you know much more about it than I. The only there are two things that I would ask you to offer your thoughts on in the discussion. One is the Druze, which, as you probably know, they come out of Ismailism, and they have strong Shiite roots. That is not to say that they are necessarily have all that much in common with Twelver Shiites in Iran, but then, of course, neither do the Fiver Shiites in Yemen. So that's one aspect that I think is interesting. The Druze are a relatively small proportion of the population in Lebanon, also in Syria, also in Israel, where they're allowed to serve in the military, as I understand it. But they punch above their weight in terms of military force, at least if we look at the history of Lebanon. So that's one thing I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on. As results to power politics, certainly there's also the idea now of Russia and Iran having been pushed much closer together by recent events in Ukraine as well as in the Middle East. And so I wonder what you would have to say about Russia today exerting influence on this region via Iran and Syria, if at all, and perhaps what sort of role Russia might have had historically in the region, which I don't know much about. How would you accommodate these details into the picture you're painting?
With the Druza, I don't know enough specific details in order to offer you, a detailed picture of what's going on today. I will, however, mention that the Druza almost represent, the most formalized element of what I really mentioned earlier, which is the oriental and you can say syncretist nature of the commingling of the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians before the arrival of these Western considerations in the 19th century, effectively. Because the Druza, you mentioned there's an Ismaili connection, which of course relates to Shiism, but they are also very much associated with Gnostic elements of Christianity as well. You can say that they represent some sort of, pure Lebanese hybrid within the sort of grand scheme. And I think by way of a sort of introduction into that, I mean, because the Druze don't really have clear allegiances one way or another. They are persecuted by Muslims, and indeed, when we talk about the French intervention into the region, which fundamentally changes the dynamics in the Middle East forever under Napoleon III, it is in response to the Druzes massacring Christians, effectively. So, in terms of their specific dynamics, again, they are an awkward consideration within the sort of grand power play. And I've been wondering when to use this effectively, because I mentioned Israel being the primary consideration, effectively, to the point that the Christians basically are, by the 1980s, they are no longer a consideration. The Gaullist, remnant that was basically connected to the Maronites is now gone, and Lebanon has gone from a success into a failed state. The reason I want to bring this up is because what we have basically created in Lebanon since the occupation by Israel from 1982 until 2000, and since the Israeli incursion in 2006 onwards, is something which was almost inconceivable back in the 1970s, when we see, you can say, this desire among many Maronites to make a militant form, basically, of Zionist Christianity, which will create a similar situation for Lebanon as had existed with the Jews in Israel, which is this fundamental idea of the Christians have been abandoned, the Druze have been abandoned by the West. There is basically no consideration other than Israel. And so, in terms of being able to conceive of Lebanon as anything other than a pet political project, we actually see the return to something which is mirroring effectively the situation that we saw before the end of the Ottoman Empire, which is an uneasy commingling, deference, and even the prospect of a fragile alliance. And this is a quote I have. I actually shared this with you a while ago when it came to like the inspiration for the stream, which is the quote from then President Michel Aoun's turning away from the West and turning towards Hezbollah. For context, Michel Aoun was the last technical president of Lebanon. Lebanon hasn't had a president for 2 years now, owing to the incredibly sort of fraught political situation, effectively, where all parties need to agree on a head of state. But he was the president back in 2022, and he was saying this as of 2008 when he was in the Lebanese parliament. We choose this long-term political option, i.e., closer collaboration with Hezbollah, because we knew that the interests of the West do not lie with us. Its interests lie with Israel on the one hand and with the oil on the other hand. We are not included among its interests at present. The only thing it cares about, i.e., the West, is resolving the problem of Israel at our expense, through the naturalization of the Palestinians in Lebanon and pleasing all producing countries, because its material interest lies there. Therefore, we have to choose a policy of coordination with all elements of Lebanese society and with our neighboring countries in order to build a strong, solid mutual relations. Lebanese society in general, and the Christians in particular, are not used to this. Therefore, it has aroused fear and concern. However, our confidence in ourselves and the choice we made and in our views have made it possible for us to stand before you and ask you to give the efforts to our undertaking a chance. A short while ago in Doha, we saw the results. All Christians in the Middle East, all Christians in the Middle East are fleeing, while the Christians of Lebanon are returning. The forecasts of the entire world for 25 to 35 years have been reading that the Christians in the Middle East are becoming extinct. Western policies have led the Christians in the Middle East towards extinction. Western policies have left not a single Christian in Palestine and the holy places. Western policies have not left a single Christian in Iraq. They intended to get rid of us by margining us and by treating us as a superfluous element in society. And again, towards extinction is obviously the inspiration behind the title of this. But again, an element superfluous, murderous indifference, collateral damage, an insignificant factor. All of these things you can consider in terms of understanding Christianity. And if there was ever an ideological motivation to support, again, for lack of a better word, I hate it, but it's modern association, but a nationalism which is associated with Christianity, it was in the cause of Lebanon in the 1970s, i.e. the restoration, or even you can say the consolidation of Maronite dominance within that region. Instead, the opposite happened. Instead, since 1990 and the Taif Accord, effectively what has presided in Lebanon is basically mutually assured political paralysis. So long as we don't kill each other, we'll take that as a sign of progress, effectively. And as we see now, with the fact that the presidency remains vacant and the fact that effectively it relies on this very, very delicate balancing act between the powers, what is essentially allowed for the situation of Christians in Lebanon essentially is to hold on to what little influence they have, while all of these foreign influences from Iran, with its connection to Hezbollah, and with the state of Israel invading and bombing Lebanon, all of these things are allowed to predominate. But for the Maronites and the Christians, it is simply a matter of survival, and we will have to make strange bedfellows in order for that to even be a consideration. So really, when we talk about this, it is also within the context of the Iraq War. But before I mention that, Semyagog, I want to answer your other question, which is the connection towards Russia. Because I really see this by way of a connection towards Syria. Syria must really feature in our conversation in terms of understanding Iran and Russia, because Syria obviously has a very large Arabic, or did have a very large Arabic Christian population. Before Hatay was surrendered to Turkey in the 1930s, Syria had been home to some of the first Christian holy sites and Christian points of conversion. Of course, Antioch being the first place where Christians began to identify as Christians. Again, that region became desolate and ruined by the 15th century, but nevertheless, the connection between Syria remains. In Syria, we see the strongest connection between, you can say, Arab Christian nationalism and secularism emerging in the 19th century in places like Damascus and Homs, Aleppo. And in the 1970s and 1980s, after the demise of Nasser's grand attempt to form some sort of new nation that would connect Syria and Egypt into a new proto-Arab state, when that fails, who comes to power? The Assad dynasty. And who do the Assads represent? Well, they represent the Alawites, who are a distinct Shia sect. Again, you can say this draws them closer towards Lebanon. It allows them to grow closer towards perhaps the Druze, some disparate connection. But also it means that the Christians in Syria, as we see with the strange bedfellows in Lebanon, also have some strange incentive to be brought over to support the Alawites, because they have a common enemy in terms of the democratization efforts that would lead to a prevalence of a Sunni majority and a Sunni state that could possibly again lead to genocide within the region. All of this is significant because if Syria is basically, and the government of Bashar al-Assad is the vehicle essentially for Russian influence, Russian bases in that region, who have, by the way, recently been attacked, as of me saying this, by Israel as well, who may again be
Yes.
hoping to connect the war in the Middle East with the war in Ukraine. All of these things are effectively connected. But the Syrian connection between Christians and the Assad regime and Lebanon and Iran, all of these things have become so connected that you would actually think that Christians ought to be a consideration, because they are a consideration to, ironically, the Shia militias and the governments of Iran and the governments of Syria, but they are less of a consideration to the West. And I find, in terms of reading that, really fascinating, because again, I'm jumping around a lot, but it's really important in terms of understanding all of these connections we're bringing here. What the 9/11 and the war on terror did is reinvigorate this, you can say, fear that the West were engaging in a neo-crusade against the Islamic states. However, this really doesn't explain anything. I mean, it represents a phobia. What ultimately happened is that whilst Al-Qaeda was defeated in Afghanistan, albeit, as we see now, the Taliban would fundamentally return, we go back and we look at what happened in Iraq. And there's just one segment here, which I'm going to read out, which is something by Colin Chapman. Just to preface this, so I've included the link in the description. Colin Chapman's article is really rather hilarious, because he's coming at this from an Islamic studies perspective. I don't know what this article was fundamentally aimed at, because he, writing a year after the Arab Spring in 2012, he's writing as if that was a fundamentally sort of grassroots movement and all that sort of thing. And of course, as you know, Semigog, that view now is ultimately preposterous. But his view in Iraq, effectively, is that the communities, Orthodox, Catholic, Eastern churches, and even Protestants, were fairly secure under Saddam Hussein, with the major exception of the Kurdish purges around Mosul in the 1980s. Because as a result of the Arab nationalist Ba'ath's, secular ideology, etc., there was less of, you can say, of a religious dimension, which allowed for the active persecution of Christians within Iraq. However, when the West comes in and deposes Saddam Hussein, 3 years later, in the plains of Nineveh, as we saw earlier on in 1932 with the massacres at Simele, we see something eerily similar, where Islamic groups that basically had been kept under wraps by Saddam Hussein are now at large again. There is anarchy in the country, and they are targeting Christians. And, we're talking about groups of hundreds of thousands of Christians in northern Iraq being turned into communities of, a couple of thousand. Then we have the Arab Spring, which is targeting Syria, and it's targeting Egypt. In Egypt, what happens? The Muslim Brotherhood comes to power. If there was a consideration essentially of bringing pressure on then President Mubarak, you have created an own goal basically in establishing a potential Islamist state in Egypt. So what was his name? Morsi or whatever, was very quickly deposed in favor of a military government under Sisi. But in Syria, things get much, much worse, because the West, of course, support the quote unquote democratic opposition against Assad and the weird, Alawite, Shiite, Christian acquiescence to the government. And the West counter that by supporting the Sunni majority. Of course, that means that the civil war is targeted disproportionately at Christians. And we see a population that Christians, essentially, Syria before the war had the largest population of Christians, even larger than Lebanon. And now they are by far the largest genuine refugee group, which is emanating out of Syria. And of course, because the West was supporting Muslim Sunni groups at the expense of Assad's regime, who comes to power? ISIS. And what do ISIS do in both Iraq and Levant, around Raqqa and around Mosul? They actively target Christians. And, in a horrific way. So, for example, in Raqqa, I read an article recently that what was once a 5,000 strong Christian community just in the city of Raqqa has now been reduced to a single parish of 26 people. The Christians in the Nineveh Plains, again, were subject to massive reprisals by Islamic State, who originally had the intent to restore the Pact of Umar, which I mentioned extensively in my stream about Christians in the Middle East. But ultimately, these provisions resulted in banishment and large-scale massacres. Indeed, as we saw, the cultural vandalization of ISIS in that region. But the point I'm making is that ISIS is the knock-on effect, or even the intended effect, of the US's foreign policy interventions in Iraq and ultimately in Syria from 2011 onwards. And as a result of that, the Christian situation in the Middle East has been utterly terrifying. And the ironic thing is that quote I mentioned out, that policy consideration by Michel Aoun, was in 2008. So this was in response to the collapse of the Saddam Hussein regime in 2003. But things only get worse from that point of view from 2011 onwards. So in terms of sort of connecting Russia back to this, all of these sort of points are interconnected when we talk about the Shiite project in the Middle East, when we talk about what group do the Christians feel safest under. And if Assad basically represents, you can say, the the interests of the minoritarian groups, then weirdly enough, if we sort of figure Russia into this as a consideration, Russia is becoming more hostile to Israel, despite the large number of Russian Jews and that ethnic and historic connection, going back to the Soviet Union, all of these things. Russia is becoming more hostile to the state of Israel. And again, as a result, you can say, of the desperate times that the very few remaining Christians find themselves in, you can say that by extension, by necessity, they find themselves, not really allies, but in terms of deference and survival, on the side of Russia and on the side of Iran and on the side of Hezbollah, which is a remarkable situation. Could you ever have conceived, back when the mandates were created, when for the first time since the Crusades, you had nominally Christian governments ruling over the entire Middle East, as in the Levant and Iraq, and now we're in the situation that we see now?
Yeah, it brings to mind your expression earlier about strange bedfellows, because I think there is a very, very interesting picture developing, and you've sketched the outlines of it very convincingly. I would just add a bit more, perhaps shading in and developing an area I think that should be drawn forward a little bit more, which is the role of Iran and Syria. Of course, you mentioned Syria, and Iran, of course, you mentioned as well, and it was implicit in what you're talking about. But as I listened to you, it began to become more clear for me. I was speaking recently with a Armenian woman who was on a stream that I had with this other guy, Matt. We were talking about the situation with Azerbaijan and Armenia and the sort of bigger picture with Georgia and Russia and Ukraine and Iran and even China. And this woman appears to me, if I understood correctly, she's of course very bright and informed and located there in Yerevan, if I remember correctly. So she's aware of what's going on there. And I believe her family has historical roots in Iran, as you're certainly well aware, AM. There are many Armenians in Iran. And of course, Armenia borders, it shares a border with Iran, and would be a critical country if Iran wanted to develop some sort of overland route as opposed to a Caspian one, running north to Russia. And her take is that it may well be that direct relationships with Russia are going to be on the wane, which is, of course, a major concern for the Armenians because they were always historically backed by Russia in one of its various incarnations. She was talking about how she regularly goes to Iran, and that in the future it may be that Armenia has to turn to Iran to be a kind of support for it. Now, I'm not sure it's entirely accurate, but I think it's not unfair to say that Armenians are a kind of distant cousin of the Iranians who turned to Christianity very, very early in their history. And so it's not entirely unnatural for there to be a relationship between Iran and Armenia. And of course, Armenia is an ancient Christian country. So when we turn to Lebanon, where we have these Christian groups, or specifically the Maronites, but other Christian groups, and their alliance in some fashion with Hezbollah at present, or at least their detente or accommodation of some kind. This picture becomes much more interesting. Again, you will know, and have even hinted at it, mentioned it here, that Syria is a massive patchwork of all these different groups: Circassians, Chechen, and Turkmen, and Christian, and Alawite, and some more besides. This is a territory, and today a government, that has long experience with dealing with minorities. Likewise, the Lebanese, or the country of Lebanon. So this is an area where they have long experience of dealing with these groups side by side. Iran certainly has experience with Zoroastrians and Armenians and Jews and the rest being present in Iran. I'm not saying it's a walk in the park for all of these groups in Iran, but it's probably safe to say that there are worse places in the Middle East today for Christians to be than in Iran. If somebody knows otherwise, I'm happy to be corrected. But the point is that Iran, and with it Russia, and these two countries, in some sense, working together, or in an increasing, or what seems to be a likely increase in a position of alliance between them, but sort of parceling out areas where one or the other will be more active in playing a role dealing with some of these minority populations. It seems that we're likely to see something that runs from Russia through Iran and into Lebanon and Syria, where it may well be that Iran, again, coming back to strange bedfellows, plays a major role, perhaps via Syria, for some of Iran's own domestic reasons, but in some way, shape, or form. How shall I say this? I'll say it this way. It seems that there is an enormous opportunity for Iran to increase its standing by being a kind of protector, even if it's indirectly and sub rosa through Syria, but a kind of protector for Christian communities, but not only in Lebanon and potentially in Syria, but also in Armenia as well, where I said I was it struck me to hear this Armenian woman with her own nationalist interests in mind, saying that in her view, and in the view of others in Armenia, they would have to turn to Iran for protection. So I bring this up because I think it fits in with a lot of what was sort of implicit in what you were just talking about.
Just something I want to bring up, because someone's mentioned it in the chat. As I've been really at pains to say, these are strange bedfellows. And as I mentioned extensively on my video concerning the fate of the agony of Middle Eastern Christendom, a lot of writers, such as the one I just quoted, Colin Chapman, like to basically say that the relationship was fundamentally harmonious, and Christians, by their very nature, were deferential towards Muslims. And like I said, this is seen when you look at the situation that we saw in the late 19th century with the Ottomans and the dissolution of those relationships, and the forced ethnic sort of coalescing and nationalisms that sort of arose out of it. There's something I will also point out, which is E. Michael Jones, who obviously everyone who knows anything about E. Michael Jones know that he has one singular focus, which everything else is subordinated to that. But in congruence with that singular focus, he was lauding the idea of Christian Muslim fraternalism on the streets of London regarding some recent quote unquote pro-nationalist protests. So again, those pro-nationalist protests are really a euphemism for something else. But the irony, of course, here is that, yes, you are completely correct. There is no such thing as some sort of deep-seated Catholic, Christian, Muslim fraternalism. there were always alliance of convenience at best, or dominance or counter dominance on the one hand. To say anything else really is, looking at some sort of political fantasy, even if you're going to draw in some comparison with Al-Andalus. And the reason I also bring that up in terms of these being forced bedfellows, I just want to bear in mind a very popular phrase that was brought up during the Syrian civil war, might even still be said, which is Alawites to the coffin and Christians to Beirut, i.e. in Syria, there can only be a Sunni Muslim population. All of these other considerations need to die. We need to genocide the Alawites, and we need to expiate the Christians in order to go over to Lebanon. It's interesting, isn't it, to consider, Semigog, that you would have thought, given the fact that Lebanon still has a sizable Christian population which is surviving under these circumstances, roughly sort of 1 to 1.5 million Christians, that could be an angle that Netanyahu can pursue. But of course, because Netanyahu is rather single-minded, his sole foreign policy consideration seems to be bringing on the United States and eliminating all sort of connections to regional allies in the process, which is rather interesting. But just to draw your connection with Armenia, I am very cynical about Armenia. I think there is, as you say, there is a natural condition for the restoration of some sort of Armenian-Iranian alliance. And you mentioned history, and everyone will know that the tentative alliance between Iran and Armenia predates Christianity. This goes all the way back to the Parthians and the Sasanians, etc. The fact that Armenia was basically the client state that switched sides between the Romans and the Iranian Persian empires, from time to time.
Right, like with Mithridates, Eupator, Tigranes, yeah.
Yes, and that would, according to that same metric, that should follow the same pattern. And you mentioned the Armenian connection to Iran further, which is to look at the connection between, say, for example, the persecuted Armenians and their protectorship under Shah Abbas in the 17th century, and the creation of an Armenian quarter in Esfahan, which was then the capital of Iran. However, the reason I'm so cynical about this is that Armenia is currently led by one Pashinyan, and he has seemingly capitulated on all fronts in order to gain the acquiescence of NATO. And the reason I say that is that if you were correct, then there would have been an active Iranian, Syrian, Russian intervention to prevent what recently happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. Everyone was focusing on October the 7th, and everyone was ignoring what was going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was basically the ethnic cleansing of a region that had been there for Armenians for thousands of years. So I very cynically believe that even though the connection perhaps should exist, that as I'm drawing this connection between Lebanon having to basically look more to Iran and more to Russia than more to the West, and again, the feeling very much shared by Lebanese politicians going all the way back to the Iraq War. Yes, the condition for Armenia to go the same route is logical, and it would fit in with this trajectory. But under its current political system, I believe Armenia has opted for oblivion, to the extent that it seems that the West might be doing something remarkable, which is actually turning Azerbaijan closer towards Russia in order to gain Armenia. So I'm very cynical, but I do concede that the point should exist under normal foreign policy considerations.
Yeah, and I certainly have no idea what's going to happen. Pashinyan, in my view, his backers are just too far away. And if things eventuate in Ukraine, as it seems increasingly likely that they will be more distant still. But yes, under the current situation, Pashinyan's behavior is a complete capitulation. I don't think that the Russians are going to stay out of it forever. And I don't think that the Iranians are going to stay out of it forever. I don't want to get into that too far and pull us away from the focus of this stream. But it is worth pointing out that is an overland route. That if Russia wants to continue to interact with Iran, by something other than sea and air, it's going to have to take an interest in. And of course, connecting to Iran is one of the ways that it can get down into the Levant without having to ask for permission from the Turks to pass through the Bosphorus.
Yes, this is it's all very interesting to consider the foreign policy implications. So there's also another point I want to mention. I'm focusing on Lebanon in terms of strange bedfellows. I'm talking about Syria. I mean, the Iraqi considerations are basically not a consideration anymore because their population has all but been, entirely exterminated. Which is horrifying to consider, that last sort of vestige. What we do have in terms of a Eastern diaspora, it really exists in the West. It exists in the United States for advocating for some form of homeland, say for example for the Assyrian people. But under the current political situation, that is so far and beyond. And with the Arab Spring, all of the trends we've seen have not only escalated but gone into overdrive. As for the state of Israel, I should mention, I tried to draw an allusion earlier with the idea of secular Arab nationalism being wedded to basically an idea of Christian acquiescence or even participation and support of this idea. We can join in and become Arabs so long as we don't have to be Muslim, effectively. Obviously, I think the association with Arabs and Islam is so sort of concrete in people's minds, but the Arabs were Christians before they were Muslims. And part of the reason why some Christians converted to Islam, obviously they were protected, and part of the reason they were protected is because of the Islamic project of the dhimmi, or protection of these groups, is that Arab nationalism was basically seen as a vehicle for uniting the tribes against the Sasanians and against the Roman Empire. Such basically a temperament existed in the early 20th century to reify this project of a new Arab nationalism. However, the legacy of that, of the association between Catholics, the association between the churches of the East, of all brands of Arabic Christians, is today manifest in Palestine. It's not simply enough to say that the Palestinian identity or Arab nationalism is associated with Muslims, because there are also many Christians there who would rather identify as being Palestinian rather than being Israeli. And again, that should, given what's going on in Gaza, and given the number of churches and religious sites in the West Bank and Gaza, even the situation of Bethlehem itself and in Gaza, and what was ultimately a segment of Jerusalem until relatively recently. All of these considerations are to make, that the fact, the situation that we're seeing with the support of Israel, the Christian support of Israel, has now reached such extremes that we're seeing Christians prefer to ally with Muslims in the region against the West. You can say it is a complete inversion of the situation that we see in the 1860s, where both Russians and Christians were basically appealing to the West in order to, have some form of national agency or protectorship. And that was part of the reason for the massacres and the genocides in the late 19th and early 20th century. But now the situation has completely inverted to the point that now the Christians are instead appealing to local powers, local authorities, regional powers such as Iran, in order to resist basically the fallout of the murderous indifference of the West via its policy towards Israel. And that's something really rather remarkable. And again, the fact that the Christians are the one leading the sort of eschatological calls in America for this messianic vision of unconditional support for Zionism, all of these fundamental contradictions that have basically arrived at this horrific situation where Christianity in the Middle East is facing extinction. I think by way of a conclusion to this sort of general framework of a discussion, that's where I'm going to leave it. But Oliver, ask me, any questions and I'll respond, or we can ask further questions, or if you want to make some sort of summary.
No, I think you've tapped it right there. I mean, it's the stuff that was anticipated earlier in the discussion. The irony of this of this Protestant and and not all Protestants certainly, but this evangelical Christian Zionism serving as a basis for the creation of circumstances that lead to the disappearance, manifest disappearance of Christians from all of these countries, and it's the luckiest among them that have managed to emigrate. In terms of the ones that have disappeared, because many of them simply died. And the foreign policy concerns that drive all of this, whether it be Western interest in securing this geopolitically strategic sort of hub that connects all of the other continents, or many of the other continents, or Zionist interests on the part of Jewish nationalists. It's a horrible mess, and the ironies are compounded by this last aspect that we touched upon. I don't claim to be an expert in it, but I really do think that we're going to see an increase in the role of Iran in this region, perhaps via Syria. And of course, we're seeing the increasing assertion of its interest in the area by Russia, which is something quite interesting as well. Russia, of course, being a kind of imperial state with large Muslim populations of its own. And there is the possibility of Russia being able to do things through the Caucasian diasporas. And for those who knowledgeable about Russian and Caucasian history who would hesitate to give any credence to that idea just because of how much the Russians and the Caucasians fought in the past, I would point them to the example of Abkhazia, where the Abkhaz have had to turn to Russia, formerly an ancient enemy of theirs in many respects. Yes, the Ossetias, yeah, they've been more aligned historically with many of the areas of the North Caucasus, as you know, aligned early with the Russians. But yes, the Abkhaz, and with their general role in the Caucasus, it's possible that the Russians could find discreet ways to exercise influence in the Middle East there, where many generals and many military people are of Circassian or Chechen descent. If I remember correctly, the personal bodyguard of the King of Jordan is Circassians. Anyway, all that by way of saying that there are ways that Russia can do it without Iran and Syria, but it seems increasingly, evident that they have chosen to do it with those countries. And so it becomes very interesting indeed when you look at the Shiites, because they're naturally going to be viewed as a minority group and are going to view themselves as a minority group, nestled as many of these populations are amidst Sunni majorities. Or at least, significant Sunni populations. So, the Druze are a type of Shiite. We've got what are they, Zaidis? I can't remember, the Fivers in Yemen. These populations historically have allied with Christians in the past. I remember in some of my preparatory reading for this that in Levantine history, British came in and allied with a Druze leader who apparently was a crypto-Christian. Although with the quote-unquote Unitarian beliefs of the Druze, it's difficult to make sense of them, being any one thing or another. It seems that they have the ability to claim, based on a universal idea, affiliations with all sorts of religious groups. Anyway, all that by way of underscoring what you closed with, that we've got a concatenation of ironies in this area, and in many respects, they're tragic ones.
Yes, just a couple of white pills really to end, which is this comment, the idea of dedication to faith. Well, just to preface this, that the Christians in the Middle East of all of these various communities, I mean, they have suffered genocide, they have suffered persecution, they have suffered the domination of Muslim states for over 1,000 years in this region. Low intensity conflict, anarchy, statelessness is basically a condition for a large subset of Christians within this whole span of history, since really the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, even during the Crusades, sporadic, constant warfare between all of these groups. And how can you not look at that dedication to the faith? Obviously, it goes deeper in some cases. In the Assyrian case and the Lebanese case, there is something tribal and nationalistic about it as well. But again, just from a Christian point of view, given you can say this extreme persecution, and you can say even the attempts of compromise between a more moderate secularist position, like conceived of, under the Bath movement, the Nada, the Renaissance, etc., etc., there are still some there. There are still that one parish that exists in the city of Raqqa that have survived Islamic State. And, for anyone, I don't know, for Catholics, say, for example, who are, unhappy, say, for example, with the direction the church is going, to look at, you can say, the disappointment and frustration directed at that, and then to look at the persecution that we see in the East, should bring much sorrow. And of course, I brought the example to the agony of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, and said ultimately, yes, there is great tribulation, there is great persecution, but with the prospect of redemption and relief. And another white pill, but I'm not entirely serious about this, which is to say, it is possible that the Christian dispensationalists may be correct, and when Netanyahu does construct the third temple, Christ will return to the earth, so and the rapture can begin.
Yes.
So there is that consideration to bear in mind.
Right.
Let's not overlook that. And Alex Butler in the chat is saying Russia and Armenia's relationship. Really, this isn't the stream to sort of get into a deep sort of history of how the Armenians, were subjugated under the Soviet Union, etc., and the false promises of that. This really isn't the stream for that. So yes, let's hope there is some deliverance for Christianity, and the dispensationalists are in fact correct, and I am horribly wrong. All right, onto the super chats. Hunger the Dye Merchant for £20, thank you. Couldn't watch this live, but thank you both for the work you've done on this topic. AM, your mini-series was excellent. Well, thank you. It was a long time ago, but thank you. It could have been much longer, but it really was just to introduce people to the topic, because it's very, very difficult to find a through line, and many, many people who've attempted this have failed miserably. Again, it was by way of an introduction. James Bogus for £4.99, thank you. The British establishment are betraying the Christian faith in Britain as we speak. Great stream, thank you. I mean, the British establishment technically is the Christian faith, because we have a state religion. We have the Church of England. Really, I think it's more sort of prescient to say that the Church of England is betraying the Christian faith in Britain as we speak. But thank you for your super chat. Horvitz, Feinberg, and Horvitz for $10. Thank you. Can Zionism and the related movements following being considered the missionario protectiva for Jews? Can Zionism and related movements, what exactly do you mean by the missionario protectiva? I haven't seen that phrase. Have you seen that phrase? Send me a goggle. I'll type it up.
No, I haven't. Protective mission, presumably.
Yeah, well, one can infer that, but what does that mean? Can Zionism and related movements follow the protective mission for the Jews? Well, yes, if you take the dispensationalist argument, then that is essentially what they are doing. And that is essentially the bedrock of American foreign policy, and will perhaps be more energetically so if the Republicans win. All right. That's really all I have to say on this topic. And yeah, thank you for coming on, Semigog. Is there anything you'd like to say before we end this?
No, just that I'm very happy to have been invited on and to be able to speak with you about this. Thanks very much.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for listening. For me, it was not as depressing as many other streams. Weirdly enough, it's the format of history of today is thinking of prospects and counterfactuals and how all of this is informing us today. And it's an evolving situation. It's towards. It doesn't say extinction, the fate of Lebanon and Middle Eastern Christians, but it's definitely the trajectory we've been headed on since 1948. Andrew, last minute super chat for 9 New Zealand dollars. Thank you. No question. Just want to say thank you from New Zealand land so much for all the incredible content you produced over the years. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. All right. Good night.